Have you ever wondered how history's most fearsome figures often come in the most unexpected forms? What if I told you that one of the most feared warriors of the southeastern frontier wasn't a battle-hardened soldier or a grizzled general, but a strikingly beautiful Cherokee woman whose tactical genius was matched only by the terror she inspired? This is the untold story of Tsisquaya, known to American settlers as the Beautiful Beast, whose name was whispered in fear throughout the Tennessee Valley during the tumultuous years following the American Revolution. Before you continue watching this incredible true story that history books have deliberately overlooked, take a moment to comment where you're watching from and subscribe to our channel. We need your support to continue bringing these hidden chapters of American history to light, stories that reveal the complex and often uncomfortable truths about our nation's formation. The story begins in 1776, as the American Revolution erupted across the colonies. While most historical accounts focus on the battles between British and colonial forces, a different kind of war was unfolding on the frontier. Cherokee tribes, who had endured decades of broken treaties and encroachment on their ancestral lands, found themselves divided on how to respond to the conflict. Some leaders favored neutrality, others alliance with the British, who had at least attempted to limit colonial expansion through the Proclamation Line of 1763. It was into this fractured political landscape that Tsisquaya was born, in a small Cherokee village near what is now Chattanooga, Tennessee. Unlike most historical figures from this era, Tsisquaya's early life was documented in unusual detail, thanks to the journals of Reverend Elijah Blackwood, a Presbyterian missionary who lived among the Cherokee from 1770 to 1785. "I have today witnessed the most curious ceremony," Blackwood wrote in April 1776. "A female child, not more than 3 summers old, has been identified by the village shaman as possessing the spirit of Utlanta, the spear-finger of ancient legends." Rather than responding with fear, as one might expect, the child's parents displayed obvious pride. The girl, called Tsisquaya, was brought before the tribal council and presented with a ceremonial knife, a ritual I have never before seen performed for one so young, and certainly never for a female child. The reference to Utlanta is particularly telling. In Cherokee mythology, Utlanta was a fearsome witch who used her sharp stone finger to cut out the livers of her victims. That a young girl would be associated with such a figure, and that this would be seen as auspicious rather than horrifying, indicates the unusual circumstances of Tsisquaya's childhood. Blackwood's journals track Tsisquaya's development with a mixture of fascination and growing concern. By age 7, she was already accompanying hunting parties, displaying an uncanny talent for tracking wounded prey. By 12, she had reportedly killed her first opponent in ritual combat, an event so unprecedented that it required special dispensation from tribal elders. The girl Tsisquaya continues to defy all natural expectations of her sex. Blackwood wrote in 1785, "Today, I observed her defeat 3 boys in the traditional wrestling contest, displaying not merely physical strength, but a calculating mind that anticipates her opponent's movements before they themselves have decided upon them. More disturbing still is the evident pleasure she takes in their submission. Where other victors show mercy, she forces her defeated foes to acknowledge their weakness in increasingly humiliating ways. Yet none dare complain, for her father's position as war chief protects her, and her mother's lineage as a descendant of the Aniwaya, Wolf clan, grants her unusual privileges even among Cherokee women, who already enjoy liberties that would shock civilized Christian women. What Blackwood failed to understand was that Tsisquaya's behavior wasn't merely the result of indulgent parenting or tribal anomaly. She was being deliberately groomed for a special role within Cherokee society, one that emerged only in times of existential threat to the tribe. Historical records from this period are fragmented, but oral histories collected by ethnographer James Mooney in the late 19th century suggest that Tsisquaya was identified from infancy as a potential Sili Agayutsa, literally witch dancer, but more accurately translated as one who transforms pain. This rare designation referred to individuals believed capable of absorbing and redirecting the collective suffering of the tribe into focused retribution against its enemies. The American Revolution provided the catalyst for Tsisquaya's transformation from unusual child to legendary figure. As colonial militias, freed from fighting the British after 1781, turned their attention to Western expansion, the pressure on Cherokee territories intensified dramatically. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and civilians killed with increasing frequency as settlers pushed beyond the boundaries established by earlier treaties. In 1783, when Tsisquaya was just 17, her village was attacked by a militia group led by Colonel Charles McDowell, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, who had turned his military experience toward claiming land in what would later become eastern Tennessee. The attack, according to multiple accounts, was particularly brutal. Unlike military engagements between Cherokee warriors and colonial forces, this assault targeted a primarily civilian settlement, while most of the hunters and warriors were away. Reverend Blackwood, who witnessed the attack, wrote with uncharacteristic emotion, "I cannot reconcile the actions I observe today with any notion of Christian conduct. Men who profess faith in our gentle Savior fell upon this village like wolves among sheep, showing no distinction between the aged, the women, or even the smallest children. That they perceived me as a fellow Christian and thus spared my life only deepens my shame at being associated with such brutality." Among those killed were Tsisquaya's mother, her two younger brothers, and her elderly grandfather. Tsisquaya herself survived only because she had been gathering medicinal herbs in the forest when the attack began. Returning to find her home in flames and her family slaughtered, she reportedly did not weep or cry out, but knelt beside each body in turn, dipping her fingers in their blood and marking her face with it. A survivor of the attack, an elderly woman named Galilahi, later described the scene to her granddaughter, who in turn shared the account with James Mooney nearly a century later. When Tsisquaya rose from beside her mother's body, she was no longer the girl we had known, though her face remained as beautiful as ever. Her eyes had changed. They held a coldness that burned like winter fire. She spoke to those of us who remained, saying, "From this day, I am dead. The girl you knew is with our ancestors. What remains is only Utlunta, the spear finger, and I will not rest until I have taken the liver from every man who did this." We believed her, for the power of Skili was visible upon her, and none dared approach her as she walked into the forest alone. Fortse, what followed over the next decade would cement Tsisquaya's reputation as both a military genius and a figure of terror among frontier settlers. Rather than joining established Cherokee resistance leaders like Dragging Canoe, she formed her own small band of followers, never more than 20 warriors at any time, and including several women who, like herself, had lost families to militia violence. Unlike conventional Cherokee war parties that typically engaged in direct combat or targeted military outposts, Tsisquaya's group employed psychological warfare tactics previously unseen on the frontier. They moved under cover of darkness, leaving few traces of their passage, and specialized in isolating individual homesteads rather than attacking settlements. A typical operation, pieced together from militia reports and settler accounts, followed a distinctive pattern. A homestead would first discover their livestock slaughtered, but not taken for food, a significant departure from typical Native American raiding patterns. Several days later, small personal items would vanish from inside the home: a child's toy, a family Bible, a wedding memento. The message was clear: We can reach you even in your most private spaces. Finally, when fear had reached its peak, the attack would come, always at night, often during storms, and with a precision that suggested intimate knowledge of the homestead's layout and routine. Colonel James Robertson, founder of Nashville and a veteran Indian fighter, wrote to the governor of North Carolina in 1786, "The frontier is gripped by a terror unlike any I have witnessed in 20 years of warfare with native tribes. These are not the work of common savages, but of a calculating mind that understands not merely how to kill, but how to break the spirit before delivering the final blow." Survivors report that the leader is a woman of uncommon beauty, who speaks perfect English and sometimes engages her victims in conversation before allowing her followers to complete their bloody work. She seems to derive particular satisfaction from forcing men to watch the suffering of their families before meeting their own end. We have placed a bounty of $100 Spanish for her capture, but not a single hunter or militiaman has proven willing to track her, out of fear that in doing so, they would themselves become her prey. What Robertson's letter didn't mention, but what settler diaries from the period reveal, is that Cisquia's attacks were not random. She targeted specifically those militiamen who had participated in attacks on Cherokee villages, particularly the massacre at her own village. With each kill, survivors reported, she would mark the back of her victim's hand with a distinctive pattern cut into the skin, a signature that soon became recognized throughout the frontier. By 1787, the pattern of killings had become so specific that authorities realized she was working through a list. James McIntyre, a militia captain, wrote to his superior, "The beast is hunting the men of McDowell's company one by one, in the precise order they were listed on the expedition muster. Of the original 43, only 17 remain alive, and those have fled the territory in fear of their lives. I must respectfully request additional forces as local militias refuse outright to pursue her, believing her protected by supernatural powers. Several men claim to have shot her at close range, only to see their bullets pass through her as if she were smoke." The supernatural elements attributed to Cisquia were almost certainly exaggerations born of fear and frontier superstition, but even accounting for such embellishments, her tactical accomplishments remain remarkable. Operating with a small force in increasingly militarized territory, she managed to evade capture for years while systematically eliminating her targets. Modern military historians studying her techniques have compared her operations to modern special forces tactics, particularly in her use of psychological warfare, meticulous planning, and the cultivation of an almost mythical persona to amplify the psychological impact of her attacks. Dr. Rebecca Tallchief, professor of Indigenous military history at the University of Tennessee, explains, "What makes Cisquia's campaign so extraordinary isn't just her success rate, but the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that informed her approach. She recognized that fear could be weaponized more effectively than arrows or bullets. By creating an atmosphere of inescapable doom among her enemies, she effectively paralyzed larger forces that could have overwhelmed her small band in direct combat. It's a level of psychological warfare sophistication that we don't typically see documented in 18th century conflicts. What historical records don't adequately capture, but what Cherokee oral traditions emphasize, is that Cisquia's reputation among settlers as a merciless killer stood in stark contrast to how she was viewed by many Cherokee. To her own people, particularly those who had suffered from militia violence, she represented a form of justice in a world where conventional justice had failed them. She was known for redistributing valuable items taken from settler homesteads to Cherokee families who had lost everything, and for helping relocate particularly vulnerable community members to safer territories further west. James Mooney's ethnographic notes include an account from C.U. Gansini, a Cherokee elder who was a child during Cisquia's active period. The whites called her a monster, but to us, she was Adawehi, angel. When militia burned our fields and we faced starvation, it was Tisquaya who appeared in the night with seeds and tools taken from the very men who had destroyed our homes. Children who had been orphaned would wake to find blankets placed over them as they slept. She moved like the wind, never visible until she wished to be seen. But her presence was felt as a protection among those who had lost all other protectors. This dual nature, merciless avenger to her enemies, guardian to her people, is key to understanding the complexity of Tisquaya's historical significance. She operated in a moral framework defined not by European concepts of warfare, with their distinctions between combatants and non-combatants, but by Cherokee concepts of balanced justice and communal responsibility. Dr. Michael Running Wolf, Cherokee historian and author of Invisible Nations, Erased Histories of the American Frontier, explains, in Cherokee cosmology, balance is fundamental. When balance is severely disrupted, as it was by the systematic violence against Cherokee communities, restoration requires equivalent action. Tisquaya's violence was not random cruelty, but a deliberate restoration of cosmic balance, taking from those who had taken, inflicting suffering on those who had caused suffering. The fact that she specifically targeted the actual perpetrators, rather than settlers in general, reflects this principle of directed, rather than generalized, retribution. By 1789, Tisquaya's campaign had created such terror among frontier settlements that it began affecting colonial expansion patterns. Land that had been eagerly sought just a few years earlier remained unclaimed or was abandoned by settlers fleeing the region. Maps from this period show a distinctive gap in settlement density precisely in the areas where Tisquaya was most active, a testament to the effectiveness of her psychological warfare campaign. Governor William Blount of the Southwest Territory, later Tennessee, wrote to Secretary of War Henry Knox in 1790, "The situation on our western frontier has become untenable. A single Cherokee woman, through methods more calculated than savage, has accomplished what entire Indian nations could not. She has halted westward expansion across a region of more than 80 square miles. Farms lie fallow, outposts have been abandoned, and trade has ground to a halt as merchants refuse to risk the roads. Most disturbing is the growing sentiment among some of our own citizens that these calamities represent divine punishment for excesses committed against the Cherokee. I have heard reports of settlers making offerings of food and valuables at the edges of their properties in hopes of appeasing this beautiful beast, as if she were some pagan deity rather than a flesh-and-blood adversary." Blount's letter reveals another dimension of Tisquaya's impact, the way her campaign began to influence settler perceptions of their own moral standing. Diaries and letters from this period show increasing instances of colonists questioning the justice of their presence on Cherokee land and expressing guilt over the treatment of indigenous populations. One particularly striking letter, written by Sarah McQueen, wife of a frontier trader, to her sister in Virginia, captures this shifting perspective. "I write to you with a troubled heart, dear sister, for I can no longer blind myself to the injustice in which we are complicit. The woman they call the beautiful beast, whom all here fear as they would fear Satan himself, is said to appear to her victims before their end, asking them a single question. Do you now understand? James says this is mere savage dramatics, but I find myself awake at night, troubled by her question. What is it she wishes them to understand? That the pain they inflicted has returned to them, that the land itself rejects their presence. I find myself thinking thoughts no Christian woman should entertain, that perhaps our claim to these territories is not as righteous as our ministers proclaim." Tisquaya's effectiveness eventually prompted a coordinated military response that far exceeded typical reactions to Native American resistance. In 1791, A specialized militia unit was formed with the sole purpose of tracking and eliminating her. Led by Major Robert Glass, a veteran Indian fighter with extensive experience in woodland warfare, the unit consisted of 50 hand-picked men armed with the most advanced weapons available, including newly designed Pennsylvania rifles with exceptional range and accuracy. Glass's written orders, preserved in Tennessee state archives, illustrate the seriousness with which authorities viewed the threat. You are to proceed with all necessary force and persistence to capture or kill the Cherokee woman known as Tsisquaya. The disruption to settlement and commerce caused by her actions can no longer be tolerated. You are authorized to offer a reward of $500 for information leading to her apprehension and to employ any indigenous trackers who may prove willing to assist, regardless of expense. This mission takes precedence over all other military objectives in the territory until completed. What followed was one of the largest manhunts of the early American frontier. For 6 months, Glass and his men combed the mountains and forests of what is now eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina. Despite their numbers, experience, and superior weaponry, they consistently failed to corner their target. Instead, they frequently found themselves becoming the hunted, with members of their company disappearing while on patrol or sentry duty. Glass's increasingly frustrated reports document a campaign unraveling in the face of an elusive enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move. April 3, 1792. Lost privates. Johnson and Williams last night. Found their bodies this morning arranged in the now familiar pattern, hands crossed over chest, each with the mark cut into their right hand. More disturbing still, discovered that our planned route for the next 3 days, which I had shared only with my senior officers, was drawn in blood upon a piece of bark placed between them. She is not merely tracking us. She has eyes and ears within our very command. As the pursuit continued, Glass's reports betray growing paranoia and superstition among his men. May 18, 1792. The men are reluctant to maintain normal watch rotations, believing that sentry duty has become a death sentence. 3 have deserted in the night, and I cannot find it in my heart to pursue them with the same vigor I would normally apply to such cowardice. Most troubling is the growing belief among the company that the beast can change her shape at will, appearing as a wolf, a deer, or even as one of our own men. I have punished such talk where I have heard it, but the whispers continue. Even I, who have never given credence to Indian superstitions, find myself starting at shadows and questioning the identities of men I have known for years. The pursuit came to a dramatic conclusion in June 1792, though not in the way authorities had intended. According to multiple accounts, including Glass's final report and Cherokee oral histories collected decades later, Tsisquaya infiltrated the militia camp during a severe thunderstorm. Rather than simply assassinating Glass, as her pattern would have suggested, she chose a different approach. She incapacitated him, dragged him from his tent, and somehow managed to transport him more than 10 miles to a prominent ridge visible from multiple settlements. What happened next was witnessed by dozens and recorded in numerous accounts with remarkable consistency, despite the observers' varying backgrounds. As dawn broke, settlers and militiamen alike saw Major Glass bound to a large oak tree that stood alone on the ridge. Standing beside him was a woman of striking appearance, her long black hair adorned with small white feathers, her face painted with ceremonial markings. For nearly an hour she remained beside her captive, occasionally appearing to speak to him, though no observers were close enough to hear what was said. Militia forces were hastily assembled to attempt a rescue, but the ridge was too distant to reach quickly. Before they could arrive, witnesses observed Tsisquaya perform what appeared to be a ceremonial dance around the tree. She then drew a knife, made a single cutting motion across Glass's chest, and disappeared into the forest below the ridge. By the time rescuers reached the site, Glass was dead, but not in the manner they had expected. Lieutenant William Harrison, who led the rescue party, wrote in his official report, "We discovered Major Glass still bound to the tree, but with no apparent injuries, save for a single shallow cut above his heart, insufficient to cause death. There was no mutilation, as has been common in the beast's previous victims. The military surgeon accompanying our party could identify no cause of death beyond what he termed a profound nervous shock." Major Glass's countenance was frozen in an expression of such extreme terror that several of our party could not bear to look upon it. More disturbing still, clutched in his hand was a small leather pouch containing 43 small stones, each marked with a symbol. The significance of this item remains unknown, though some among the party suggested it represented the souls of those Cherokee killed in the massacre that allegedly began the beast's vendetta. The death of Major Glass marked a turning point in Sisquaya's campaign. Following this incident, her pattern of systematic revenge killings ceased almost entirely. While occasional attacks attributed to her occurred over the next 2 years, they lacked the signature elements and tactical sophistication of her earlier operations. By 1794, even these sporadic incidents had ended, leading authorities to conclude that she had either died or relocated beyond the territorial boundaries. Cherokee oral histories, however, tell a different story. According to these accounts, Sisquaya considered her primary mission of balanced retribution complete with Glass's death. The pouch of stones represented the specific individuals whose deaths she had vowed to avenge, with Glass being the final name on her list. Having restored balance according to Cherokee concepts of justice, she turned her attention to a different purpose, guiding her people through the increasingly dangerous process of adaptation and survival in a changing world. The later years of Sisquaya's life remain shrouded in mystery and conflicting accounts, a historical ambiguity that itself reflects her transformation from physical to symbolic presence in both Cherokee and settler communities. What seems clear from the fragmentary evidence available is that she shifted from direct military resistance to a more complex role as advisor, strategist, and spiritual leader during a period of profound transition for the Cherokee Nation. Between 1795 and 1810, as the Cherokee faced increasing pressure to cede their traditional territories and adapt to European American economic and political systems, contemporary accounts mention a female advisor of unusual influence among certain Cherokee leaders, particularly those advocating for strategic adaptation rather than either full assimilation or doomed military resistance. Reverend Abraham Steiner, a Moravian missionary who established schools among the Cherokee during this period, wrote in his journal in 1800, "Among the counselors who guide the Cherokee Nation through these troubled times is a woman whose presence commands extraordinary respect from even the most established chiefs. She is said to be of advancing years, though her appearance belies this, displaying a physical vigor and beauty that many attribute to supernatural causes. While she is never introduced to white visitors by name, the deference shown to her opinions suggests authority derived from some remarkable history that none will discuss directly. When I inquired discreetly about her identity, I was told simply, 'She is one who has seen both worlds and returned to tell of it.' The obvious evasion, coupled with the unease my questioning produced, persuaded me not to pursue the matter further. The description matches what we might expect of Sisquaya in her early 40s, still striking in appearance, but now channeling her strategic acumen into political rather than military resistance. Cherokee oral histories collected by anthropologist James Mooney suggest that during this period, she became known as Tsiyu Unanui, or Principal Fisher, a name referring to her ability to fish out the true intentions behind the often deceptive treaty offers presented to Cherokee leaders. According to these accounts, Sisquaya's experiences fighting settlers had given her unique insight into European American psychology and tactics. She advocated neither for the complete rejection of change nor for full assimilation, but rather for a calculated adaptation that would preserve essential Cherokee values and autonomy while selectively incorporating advantageous aspects of the encroaching culture. John Ridge, a prominent Cherokee leader who later became controversial for his support of the Treaty of New Echota, which led to the Trail of Tears, reportedly sought Tsisquaya's counsel as a young man. In a letter to his father dated 1815, Ridge wrote, "I have spoken with the one you suggested, though she would not at first agree to meet with me, perhaps because of my education among the whites. Eventually she consented, and we talked through the night beside the falls at Nickajack. She speaks with the wisdom of one who has walked through fire and emerged transformed rather than consumed. She told me, the white man's greatest strength is not his weapons, but his writing. Learn to fight with paper and ink, for that is the battlefield on which our future will be decided." And I leave our meeting with much to consider about the path that lies before us. The reference to Nickajack is significant, as this was a settlement associated with the Chickamauga Cherokee, a more militant faction led by Dragging Canoe, who had rejected earlier treaties ceding Cherokee lands. That Tsisquaya would be found in such a location suggests she maintained connections with resistance-minded communities while simultaneously advising more accommodationist leaders like Ridge, a position that allowed her to influence Cherokee strategy across its internal political spectrum. As American pressure on Cherokee lands intensified in the 1820s, with Georgia and other states asserting jurisdiction over indigenous territories in defiance of federal treaties, Tsisquaya appears to have become increasingly focused on preservation of cultural knowledge rather than territorial defense. Cherokee accounts describe her traveling extensively throughout Cherokee territories, typically accompanied by two younger women identified as her apprentices, collecting and recording traditional knowledge, particularly regarding medicinal plants, ceremonial practices, and oral histories. Dr. Elizabeth Toombs, Cherokee ethnobotanist at the University of North Carolina, explains the significance of this work. By the 1820s, it was becoming clear to many Cherokee that physical displacement from their traditional territories was increasingly likely. Tsisquaya's efforts to systematically document traditional knowledge, particularly regarding plants that might not be available in Western territories, represented a form of cultural preservation that was as strategic as her earlier military resistance. She was fighting to ensure that even if the Cherokee lost their land, they would not lose their identity and knowledge. Evidence of these preservation efforts survives in the form of several botanical manuscripts held in the archives of the Museum of the Cherokee Indian in Cherokee, North Carolina. Written in the Cherokee syllabary developed by Sequoyah in the 18-teens and early 20s, these texts contain detailed information on hundreds of medicinal plants, their preparation and applications. While not attributed directly to Tsisquaya, Cherokee tradition identifies them as transcriptions of her knowledge, created by her apprentices, as the syllabary made written preservation of Cherokee knowledge newly possible. The final confirmed historical reference to Tsisquaya comes from the journals of Baptist missionary Evan Jones, who worked among the Cherokee just prior to their forced removal on the Trail of Tears. In an entry dated October 1837, Jones wrote, "Today I encountered an elderly Cherokee woman whose dignity of bearing and penetrating gaze left a profound impression. She approached me not as a potential convert, but as an equal engaged in the same essential work, the preservation of her people. You seek to save souls," she told me, "while I seek to save memories. Perhaps we are not so different." When I asked her name, those accompanying her became visibly uncomfortable. She merely smiled and said, "I have been called many things. The name that matters is the one the Creator knows." Later, my Cherokee guide informed me in hushed tones that I had been speaking with the woman once known to settlers as the Beautiful Beast, though he refused to elaborate further, saying only, "Some stories are not mine to tell." If this was indeed Sisquaya, she would have been in her early 70s at the time, advanced in years, but still actively engaged in her people's struggle. This encounter occurred just months before the Cherokee removal began in earnest, with federal troops forcing Cherokee citizens from their homes into internment camps before the brutal journey west that would become known as the Trail Where They Cried. Sit. Whether Sisquaya herself experienced the Trail of Tears remains uncertain. Cherokee oral histories contain conflicting accounts. Some suggest she died shortly before removal began, having foreseen the coming calamity and chosen to join her ancestors rather than witness it. Others claim she walked the trail, using her extensive knowledge of medicinal plants to save many who would otherwise have perished from disease and exposure during the journey. Still others insist she escaped removal entirely, retreating into the most remote regions of the Smoky Mountains to join the small bands of Cherokee who successfully evaded capture and remained in their ancestral homeland. This ambiguity itself became part of Sisquaya's legacy. To Cherokee communities struggling to rebuild their lives in Indian Territory, later Oklahoma, stories of Sisquaya's potential survival offered hope and a symbolic connection to both their ancestral homeland and their tradition of resistance. Meanwhile, among the eastern band of Cherokee who had avoided removal, legends of Sisquaya's presence in the mountains reinforced their own claims to have maintained an unbroken connection to their traditional territories. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century and into the 20th, reports occasionally surfaced in both eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina of encounters with a woman matching Sisquaya's description. Though these accounts obviously cannot represent the historical figure unless she achieved a truly biblical lifespan. More likely, these sightings represent either deliberate adoption of her persona by later Cherokee women continuing her tradition of resistance or purely mythological elaborations of her legend. By the early 20th century, when James Mooney was conducting his ethnographic work among the eastern Cherokee, Sisquaya had been transformed from historical figure to cultural archetype. Mooney noted that stories about her were told with particular frequency during periods of crisis or external threat to Cherokee communities, suggesting her narrative had become a cultural resource invoked specifically to inspire resistance and cultural pride. Dr. Rebecca Tallchief explains, "What we see with Sisquaya is a pattern common to many indigenous resistance leaders who successfully evaded final defeat or capture. Their unresolved fate allows them to transcend historical limitations and become ongoing symbolic presences in their communities. Think of Crazy Horse, who was never photographed and whose burial place remains unknown, or the Mexican revolutionary Emiliano Zapata, rumored for decades to have escaped death. This ambiguity allows the figure to remain alive in cultural memory, not as a completed historical chapter, but as a continuing presence. The transformation of Sisquaya from historical figure to cultural symbol was facilitated by several factors beyond the uncertainty of her fate. Her legendary beauty, contrasted with her fearsome reputation, created a compelling narrative tension. Her strategic intelligence and adaptability, shifting from military to political to cultural resistance as circumstances changed, demonstrated a complexity that transcended simple categorization. Perhaps most significantly, her story embodied the fundamental Cherokee value of balance. She was both destroyer and preserver, both warrior and healer, embodying the essential duality at the heart of Cherokee cosmology. In the 20th century, as Native American communities began reclaiming and openly celebrating their historical resistance to colonization, Sisquaya's legacy experienced a significant revival. The Civil Rights era and subsequent Red Power movement of the 1960s and 70s saw renewed interest in indigenous resistance figures, particularly those who had been erased or demonized in mainstream historical accounts. Wilma Mankiller, who would later become the first female principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, wrote in her memoir that stories of Tsisquaya had inspired her as a young activist. What drew me to her story wasn't just her courage, but her strategic thinking, her understanding that resistance must evolve as circumstances change. She knew when to fight directly, and when to work behind the scenes, when to stand visible in opposition, and when to build quietly from within. These are lessons that remained relevant for Indigenous leaders centuries after her time. In contemporary Cherokee communities, Tsisquaya's legacy continues to evolve. While scholarly historical work has helped establish the factual framework of her life and actions, her significance extends far beyond academic interest. She has become a multifaceted cultural symbol, invoked in contexts ranging from environmental protection of traditional Cherokee territories to advocacy for Indigenous women's leadership. Chad Corntassel Smith, former principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, observed in a 2008 interview, "Every generation of Cherokee finds the Tsisquaya they need in her story. During times of external threat, we remember her as the fierce protector. In times of internal division, we recall her ability to move between different Cherokee factions, maintaining connections across political differences. When we face new challenges requiring innovation, we invoke her adaptability and strategic thinking. She has become not just a historical figure, but a cultural resource we continuously reinterpret to find guidance for current challenges." Archaeological evidence has added fascinating dimensions to Tsisquaya's story in recent decades. Excavations at several late 18th century Cherokee settlement sites have uncovered distinctive artifacts that align with descriptions of her practices. At a site near present-day Murphy, North Carolina, archaeologists discovered a hidden storage chamber containing European weapons that had been modified with Cherokee decorative elements and spiritual symbols, precisely the kind of hybrid technology that historical accounts attribute to Tsisquaya's band. More dramatically, a 2011 excavation in eastern Tennessee uncovered what appears to have been a specialized processing site for medicinal plants, carbon-dated to the exact period of Tsisquaya's known activities in the region. The site contained grinding stones, specialized ceramic containers, and traces of over 30 different plant species, many with known medicinal applications in Cherokee tradition. Most notably, the site included a concealed underground chamber that could have served as both storage facility and temporary shelter, suggesting exactly the type of hidden infrastructure that would have supported Tsisquaya's elusive operations. Dr. Michael Running Wolf, who consulted on the excavation, notes the significance. What we're seeing in the archaeological record is evidence of sophisticated resistance infrastructure, hidden supply caches, communication systems, and support networks that would have allowed Tsisquaya's small band to operate effectively across a large territory despite being heavily outnumbered. This physical evidence corroborates historical accounts of her tactical sophistication and suggests her operations were even more organized than written records indicate. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Tsisquaya's legacy is how it challenges conventional historical narratives about Indigenous resistance. Unlike male war leaders who typically engaged in direct, visible opposition through conventional warfare, her approach emphasized psychological impact, strategic targeting, and the maintenance of infrastructure that could support long-term resistance. Her later transition to cultural preservation work represents an early recognition that survival would require not just physical resistance, but the protection of knowledge and identity. In this sense, Tsisquaya represents what Indigenous studies scholars have termed survivance, a concept that combines survival and resistance, emphasizing the active presence of Native peoples rather than their victimization or tragic disappearance. Her story demonstrates how Indigenous resistance has always been more complex, adaptive, and forward-thinking than colonial narratives have acknowledged. As we conclude this exploration of the woman known as the Beautiful Beast, it's worth reflecting on why her story remains so compelling across centuries and cultures. For Cherokee people, she represents the enduring spirit of resistance and cultural persistence in the face of overwhelming odds. For broader American society, her story challenges simplistic narratives about westward expansion and forces a reckoning with the complex moral questions underlying the nation's formation. Perhaps most importantly, Tisquaya's legacy reminds us that history is rarely as simple as we wish it to be. She was neither the one-dimensional savage of colonial nightmares, nor the romanticized noble warrior of later revisionist accounts. She was a complex human being responding to extraordinary circumstances with the tools available to her: intelligence, courage, cultural knowledge, and a fierce determination to protect her people and restore balance to a world violently thrown out of alignment. The duality at the core of her story, beautiful yet fearsome, destructive yet protective, reflects the essential tensions within all human experience. Her ability to transform from vengeful warrior to political strategist to cultural preservationist demonstrates the human capacity for evolution and growth even through the most traumatic circumstances. For those who have faith, Tisquaya's story might also be understood as a powerful reminder that God's justice often works through unexpected instruments. Throughout Scripture, we see how those who have suffered greatly sometimes become vehicles for profound change, not through passive acceptance, but through determined action guided by deeper spiritual understanding. Just as David stood against Goliath or Esther risked everything to save her people, Tisquaya confronted overwhelming power with courage, drawn from both cultural tradition and personal conviction. As Jesus taught, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The indigenous wisdom and resistance strategies that American society long dismissed or demonized are increasingly recognized as offering vital perspectives on sustainability, community, and balance that our modern world desperately needs. Tisquaya's story, once told only in whispers, now finds resonance in contemporary conversations about justice, gender, cultural survival, and the complex moral legacy of American expansion. The next time you drive through the mountains of eastern Tennessee or western North Carolina, consider the layered history beneath the scenic beauty. These landscapes were not simply wilderness, awaiting discovery, but homelands defended with remarkable courage and strategic brilliance. And perhaps, in the whisper of wind through ancient trees, or the play of shadows across mountain ridges, you might sense an echo of the woman whose intelligence and determination made her both the most feared and the most legendary figure of her era. Tisquaya, the beautiful beast, whose story reminds us that history's most fascinating figures often defy our simplest categories and challenge us to see the world through different eyes. For in understanding her story, complex, troubling, yet ultimately human, we come closer to understanding not just Cherokee history or American history, but the enduring human struggle for justice, survival, and meaning in a world where power too often overwhelms truth. And in that understanding lies the potential for healing divisions that have shaped our collective past and continue to influence our shared future. Have you ever wondered about the dark chapters of American history that never made it into your school textbooks? What if I told you that while the nation was tearing itself apart during the Civil War, another tragedy was unfolding in the shadows, one that targeted Native American women and remained buried in obscurity for generations? Before we dive into this disturbing and largely untold story that has been systematically erased from our collective memory, take a moment to comment where you're from and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue to uncover these hidden chapters of American history that powerful forces would prefer remained forgotten. The year was 1862. As the nation's attention focused on the bloody battlefields of Antietam and Shiloh, in the territories of the American West, particularly in areas of present-day Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska, a system of exploitation was being established with chilling efficiency and devastating consequences for indigenous communities. These operations would later be euphemistically called houses of pleasure in military correspondence, but they were, in reality, forced brothels, camps where Native American women from various tribes were held against their will and subjected to sexual exploitation by military personnel, government contractors, and occasionally civilian settlers. These institutions represented one of the darkest intersections of the ongoing displacement of indigenous peoples and the chaos of the Civil War era. Professor Eleanor Blackhawk of the University of Oklahoma, who has spent 20 years researching this subject through fragmented records and oral histories, explains, "What makes these camps particularly insidious is how deliberately they were erased from official records. We're piecing together a history that powerful interests intended to remain buried forever." The origins of these camps can be traced to the displacement of Native American tribes that accelerated during the Civil War. With federal troops drawn away to fight the Confederacy, Western territories experienced reduced military presence. This vacuum created opportunities for corruption and exploitation by unscrupulous officials who operated with minimal oversight. Colonel James Westfield, assigned to the Department of the Missouri in 1861, appears in several documents as an architect of what would become the Houses of Pleasure system. His correspondence, discovered in a private collection in 1997, reveals the calculated nature of these operations. In a letter dated August 14, 1862, addressed to a Lieutenant William Harper, Westfield wrote, "The problem of maintaining morale among the men stationed in these isolated posts requires creative solutions. The local indigenous women, many now displaced from their tribal lands and without means of support, present an opportunity to address this need while further weakening tribal resistance through the disruption of their family structures." This clinical language masked a brutal reality. What Westfield termed creative solutions and opportunities translated to systematic kidnapping, coercion, and exploitation of indigenous women, often beginning with raids on villages or attacks on refugee groups traveling to assigned reservations. Sarah Whitefeather, a historian of Cherokee descent who has documented oral histories from tribal elders, describes accounts passed down through generations. The stories tell of military detachments arriving at villages, demanding young women be handed over for domestic service at military installations. Chiefs who refused faced immediate violence. Some were executed on the spot as examples. Families were told the women would be employed as laundresses or cooks and would send wages home. It was a lie designed to minimize initial resistance. Once taken to these camps, the women found themselves in what amounted to prison compounds. Typically located near but separate from military installations, these facilities were often constructed to appear as auxiliary service buildings to casual observers. Surrounded by fences and guarded by soldiers or contracted security personnel, they were designed specifically to prevent escape. Mary Runninghawk, whose great-grandmother survived one such camp near Fort Gibson in Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, shared the account passed down in her family. She told of wooden buildings divided into small rooms, barely larger than closets. The women were issued military bedding and basic hygiene items, but little else. They were informed that attempts to escape would result in severe punishment or execution. Many didn't speak English and had no idea where they were in relation to their homes. The systematic nature of these operations becomes clear in quartermaster records from several Western forts. Requisitions for construction materials, bedding, and supplies for special morale facilities appear in ledgers from forts across the territories. These requisitions were often approved through separate channels from normal military expenditures, with oversight from officials like Westfield rather than through standard military procurement processes. Dr. Thomas Jenkins, military historian at West Point, notes, "What's striking in these records is the bureaucratic efficiency. These weren't ad hoc arrangements, but a coordinated system with its own supply chains, personnel assignments, and administrative procedures. The effort to maintain plausible deniability in official records is evident in the euphemistic language and separate accounting systems. The women forced into these camps came from numerous tribes, including Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Comanche, Arapaho, and Sioux nations. While some were taken during direct raids, others were separated from their families during forced relocations. A significant number were refugees who had already been displaced by conflict, women who had lost male family members, and tribal protection through earlier violence. Professor Blackhawk explains, the targeting was strategic. They focused on women from tribes already weakened by displacement or conflict, and particularly on those who had lost male protectors. The system exploited existing vulnerabilities created by federal Indian policies. It was predatory in the most calculated sense. Conditions within these camps were brutal by all accounts. Women were subjected to constant sexual violence, with daily visitations by military personnel who paid fees that went not to the women, but to the camp administrators. Medical records recovered from several forts include treatment logs for Indigenous female dependents, documenting injuries, pregnancies, and diseases consistent with sexual violence and exploitation. Dr. Elizabeth Tallchief, who has studied these medical records extensively, notes, the clinical detachment in these documents is chilling. Women are identified by numbers rather than names. Treatments for injuries from excessive client enthusiasm, a euphemism for violent assault, are recorded alongside matter-of-fact notes about sexually transmitted infections and pregnancies. The dehumanization is complete in these records. Particularly disturbing are the notations regarding pregnancy outcomes. Many women who became pregnant were subjected to primitive abortion procedures without consent, while others were permitted to carry pregnancies to term, after which their children were typically taken away, some to orphanages, others to military families seeking children. These practices represented an additional layer of trauma and contributed to the disruption of Indigenous family structures and cultural continuity. The women were kept in conditions of extreme control and isolation. Speaking their native languages was often forbidden, an early form of cultural suppression that would later become formalized in government boarding schools. Contact between women from different tribes was limited to prevent coalition building and resistance. Those who attempted escape or resistance faced brutal punishments, including beatings, food deprivation, and in some documented cases, execution, as examples to others. Lieutenant James Blackwater, who served at Fort Laramie from 1863 to 1865, left a rare critical account in his private journals, discovered by his descendants in the 1970s. What we are permitting to occur in the auxiliary facilities is a disgrace to the uniform and to our nation. These are not willing participants, as the officers claim, but prisoners being subjected to conditions that would horrify the public if exposed. I have requested transfer 3 times, unwilling to remain complicit in this system of depravity. Blackwater's requests for transfer were eventually granted, but his attempts to report the abuses to higher authorities appear to have been suppressed. His journal notes, "My reports on conditions at the facility have been returned without comment, with verbal instructions to focus on matters relevant to military operations. The conspiracy of silence extends to the highest levels of command in this territory. The financing of these operations reveals another layer of exploitation. Ledgers recovered from several forts show that soldiers and other visitors paid fees for access to the women. These funds were recorded as special recreational receipts and were used to supplement military budgets for everything from weapons to officer comforts. In effect, the sexual exploitation of Indigenous women became a revenue stream for Western military operations during a time when the Civil War strained federal military budgets." Dr. Robert Eaglefeather, economist and historian specializing in 19th-century military finance, explains, "These operations essentially turned sexual violence into a commodity that helped fund military operations during a time of budgetary constraints. The financial records show considerable sums flowing through these recreational accounts, enough to represent a significant supplementary funding source for Western forts. What makes this history particularly difficult to trace is the deliberate effort to erase it from official records as the Civil War wound down and federal oversight of Western territories increased. In 1865, as the war concluded and federal attention could once again turn westward, correspondence between officials like Westfield and regional commanders shows growing concern about potential discovery of the system. A letter from Colonel Westfield to commanders of 3 forts in September 1865 reads, "With increased congressional attention to territorial affairs forthcoming, it is imperative that the special morale facilities be transitioned to alternative arrangements immediately. All documentation relating to these operations should be removed from official records and conveyed to my office for secure disposition. Personnel should be prepared to characterize any indigenous female dependents as voluntary domestic workers if questioned." Tetters. This systematic records destruction makes establishing the full scope of these operations challenging for historians. However, the evidence that has survived, through overlooked documents, private journals, medical records, and indigenous oral histories, paints a picture of a widespread system that operated across multiple territories and affected hundreds, potentially thousands, of indigenous women. The fate of the women when these camps began to be dismantled in 1865 varied. Some records indicate that women were simply released with no resources or support, often hundreds of miles from their tribal territories. Others were transferred to reservations, regardless of their actual tribal affiliations. A disturbing number of entries in fort medical logs simply note "Indigenous female dependent deceased," with no further explanation, raising questions about potential killings to eliminate witnesses. Sarah Whitefeather notes, "In the oral histories I've collected, there are accounts of women who returned to their tribes only to face ostracism due to their experiences. Others never returned at all. Some were married off to settlers or soldiers, marriages that were often another form of continued control rather than consensual unions. The trauma extended far beyond the immediate physical abuse to disrupt lives and communities for generations." As Reconstruction began and reform movements gained strength in the late 1860s, there were moments when this history nearly came to light. Indian Affairs Inspector Harold Jenkins submitted a report to Congress in 1868 that obliquely referenced immoral practices regarding indigenous women at certain Western military installations requiring immediate congressional investigation. This potential exposure was quickly contained. Within weeks of submitting his report, Jenkins was reassigned to a position in Washington that removed him from field inspection duties. The referenced section was struck from the final version of the report presented to Congress, with the justification that unsubstantiated allegations could undermine public confidence in military administration of Indian affairs during this sensitive period of national reunification. The effectiveness of this cover-up is evidenced by the near-total absence of these camps from conventional historical accounts of the period. While the Indian Wars, forced relocations, and even massacres have received historical acknowledgement, however inadequate, the systematic sexual exploitation of indigenous women in these camps remained largely undocumented in mainstream historical narratives. Professor Blackhawk explains, "This represents a double erasure. First, the physical and cultural violence against these women, and then the erasure of even the memory of that violence from historical records. It's a form of historiographic violence that compounds the original crimes by denying their existence and silencing the victims." The silence began to break only in the 1970s, when the Native American rights movement created space for indigenous scholars and community members to bring forward oral histories that had been preserved despite official erasure. Even then, these accounts were often dismissed by mainstream historians as unverifiable or exaggerated without the hard evidence of official documentation, the very documentation that had been deliberately destroyed. The breakthrough came in 1997, when the private papers of Colonel Westfield were discovered during the renovation of a historic home in St. Louis that had once belonged to his family. Hidden in a sealed compartment within a desk were hundreds of documents, including correspondence, financial records, and even crude maps showing the locations of these facilities across several territories. Dr. Margaret Tallbear, who was among the first scholars to examine these papers, recalls, "It was one of those rare moments in historical research where you find the smoking gun, the evidence that confirms what people have been saying for generations but couldn't prove by Western academic standards." Here was the architect of the system, in his own words, detailing how it operated, how it was financed, and how it was concealed. The Westfield Papers, as they came to be known, provided the documentary evidence that could not be dismissed. They corroborated the oral histories and filled in crucial details about how the system operated at an administrative level. Perhaps most importantly, they provided irrefutable evidence of the deliberate nature of both the exploitation and its subsequent cover-up. One particularly damning document was a memorandum from Westfield to several fort commanders dated November 1865, which read in part, "With the conclusion of hostilities between North and South, we must anticipate increased scrutiny of territorial affairs. The special facilities have served their purpose in maintaining morale and generating supplementary revenue, but now present an unacceptable liability. Documentation must be eliminated, facilities repurposed or dismantled, and personnel sworn to secrecy." The official position, should questions arise, is that Indigenous women were employed voluntarily as laundresses and domestic workers, compensated fairly for their services. This systematic erasure was largely successful for over a century. Even after the discovery of the Westfield Papers, integration of this history into mainstream historical narratives has been slow and often met with resistance. Some military historians have attempted to characterize these camps as isolated incidents rather than a systematic program, despite evidence to the contrary. Others have questioned the reliability of the documents or suggested they have been misinterpreted. Dr. Jenkins notes, "There's a form of institutional defensiveness that makes acknowledging these atrocities difficult. It requires confronting the fact that the U.S. military, an institution central to American identity, engaged in systematic sexual exploitation and trafficking of Indigenous women. That's a difficult truth to integrate into national narratives about westward expansion and the Civil War era. For Indigenous communities, particularly the women descendants of those who suffered in these camps, the emerging historical record has validated what their families have known for generations." Mary Runninghawk explains, "My great-grandmother never stopped telling her story, even when no one outside our family would listen or believe her. She wanted the truth preserved. Finding these documents that confirm what she experienced has brought a certain validation, though it doesn't heal the wounds that have been passed down through generations." The historical significance of these camps extends beyond the immediate suffering they caused. They represent an intersection of multiple forms of violence against Indigenous peoples: physical, sexual, cultural, and historiographic. They demonstrate how the chaos and reduced oversight of the Civil War period created opportunities for exploitation that aligned with broader goals of subjugating Indigenous populations and weakening tribal structures. Professor Blackhawk argues, "These camps weren't aberrations but logical extensions of federal Indian policy. They served multiple goals: providing recreation for soldiers, generating revenue, and contributing to the destruction of Indigenous family and social structures. They were weapons of cultural destruction dressed up as morale-boosting enterprises." As we continue to uncover and understand this dark chapter in American history, we are confronted with difficult questions about historical memory, accountability, and healing. How do we acknowledge atrocities that were deliberately erased from official records? How do we honor the experiences of victims whose voices were silenced? And how do we integrate these uncomfortable truths into our understanding of American history? Sarah Whitefeather reflects, every time we recover a piece of this history, we're engaging in an act of resistance against that original erasure. We're saying that these women's experiences matter, that the truth matters, even when it's painful to confront. Didit. The story of the Houses of Pleasure forces us to reconsider conventional narratives about the Civil War era and westward expansion. It reveals a calculated exploitation of Indigenous women that operated in the shadows of more visible historical events, an exploitation that continued the process of displacement and cultural destruction through targeted gender violence. For the descendants of those who suffered in these camps, the emerging historical record offers a complex legacy. On one hand, it validates family histories that were preserved despite official denials. On the other, it opens wounds that have never fully healed and raises questions about justice and accountability that have no easy answers. Mary Runninghawk speaks to this complexity. When my great-grandmother told me these stories as a child, she always ended by saying, "Remember, but don't let remembering consume you." I think about that a lot as more of this history comes to light. The remembering is essential, but so is finding a way to move forward while carrying these truths. As historians continue to research this subject, new documents occasionally surface that add to our understanding. In 2010, a collection of letters from a military physician stationed at Fort Laramie was discovered in a university archive, having been misclassified for decades. These letters contain detailed observations about the health conditions of women in what the doctor euphemistically called the auxiliary quarters. Dr. Elizabeth Tallchief, who analyzed these medical accounts, notes, "The physician's clinical descriptions reveal the severe physical toll of sexual exploitation. He documents traumatic injuries, multiple pregnancies in young women, widespread sexually transmitted infections, and psychological trauma manifesting in physical symptoms. While he occasionally expresses concern, he never challenges the system itself, instead focusing on maintaining the women's capacity to fulfill their assigned duties." These medical records provide important insights into the physical and psychological impacts of the camps on the women held there. They document not only the immediate effects of sexual violence, but also long-term health consequences, including reproductive damage, chronic pain, and conditions consistent with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Perhaps the most poignant historical sources are the few direct testimonies from survivors that were recorded late in their lives. In the 1930s, as part of the Federal Writers Project, a small number of elderly Indigenous women shared accounts of their experiences in these camps. These testimonies were largely excluded from published collections at the time, deemed too disturbing and potentially damaging to government institutions, but the raw transcripts were preserved in archives. One such testimony from a Cherokee woman, identified only as Mr. Chaniduz. "They took me when I was 15 summers. My father was already dead from the white man's disease, and my brothers had been sent to different places. They came to where we were staying and said I would work cleaning for the soldiers and send money back to my mother. It was all lies. They put me in a small room at the fort, where different men would come day and night. If I fought, they would beat me. If I tried to run, they said they would kill me. I was there for 3 winters before the place was closed. They gave me to a white settler as a wife, but he was not different from the others, just only one instead of many. It was many years before I found my way back to my people. Some did not believe what I told them. Others had daughters and sisters who never returned, and they believed." These first-hand accounts, though few in number, provide crucial insights into the lived experiences of the women and the multiple layers of trauma they endured, from the initial separation from their communities, through the daily violence of the camps, to the difficulties of returning to societies that had been fragmented by the same forces that created the camps. The long-term impacts of these camps on indigenous communities were profound. Beyond the immediate trauma inflicted on the women themselves, the camps contributed to the disruption of family structures, cultural transmission, and tribal cohesion that federal policies already targeted through other means. Children born in these circumstances were often removed from their mothers, creating another generation separated from their cultural heritage and contributing to the fracturing of indigenous kinship systems. Professor Blackhawk explains, these camps operated as a particularly gendered form of violence within the broader context of cultural genocide. By targeting women specifically, they struck at indigenous communities' ability to reproduce both physically and culturally. This wasn't incidental. It aligned perfectly with federal objectives of tribal dissolution and assimilation. The erasure of this history from official records and mainstream historical narratives has had its own impacts, creating a gap in our collective understanding of this period and denying acknowledgement to survivors and their descendants. This erasure has contributed to the marginalization of indigenous experiences in American historical consciousness and impeded efforts toward justice and healing. The rediscovery of this history beginning in the 1990s has prompted difficult conversations within both indigenous communities and American society more broadly. For many Native American nations, it has meant confronting painful legacies that had been preserved in family histories but rarely discussed publicly. For American historical institutions, it has required acknowledging a significant blind spot in conventional narratives of the Civil War era and westward expansion. Dr. Robert Eaglefeather notes, this history challenges comfortable narratives about American progress. It reveals that at the same moment, the nation was ostensibly fighting a war that would end slavery in the South. It was establishing a different form of bondage for indigenous women in the West. That contradiction is difficult to reconcile with triumphalist versions of American history. The discovery of the Westfield Papers in 1997 catalyzed new research into this subject as historians began searching archives with fresh eyes, looking for documents that might have been overlooked or misclassified. This research has expanded our understanding of how extensively these operations were spread across the Western territories. Professor Eleanor Blackhawk explains, based on the evidence we've uncovered so far, we can confidently identify at least 27 camps that operated during the 1862 to 1866 period, spread across territories that now comprise Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. Given the gaps in the record, the actual number was likely higher. Conservatively, we estimate that between 1,500 and 3,000 indigenous women were victimized in these camps. The geographical distribution of these camps followed strategic patterns. They were typically established near military installations that were sufficiently remote to minimize outside observation, positioned near transportation routes to facilitate access by military personnel and contractors, located in regions where indigenous populations had been recently displaced or were in the process of being relocated. This strategic positioning reflected the calculated nature of the system and its integration with broader military operations and federal Indian policy. These weren't opportunistic arrangements, but a systematized form of exploitation that operated within and alongside official structures of power. Dr. Thomas Jenkins observes, what's striking from a military history perspective is how these operations were integrated into standard logistical systems while being kept officially separate. They used military resources, personnel, and supply chains, but with parallel record-keeping and command structures designed to maintain deniability. It's a remarkable example of institutional compartmentalization to facilitate abuse. The Civil War context was crucial to how these operations developed and escaped scrutiny. With federal attention focused on the existential threat of Southern secession, Western territories experienced reduced oversight. Military commanders in these regions had unprecedented autonomy, creating conditions where exploitative systems could develop with minimal interference from Washington. This connection to the Civil War extended beyond just the opportunity created by reduced oversight. As the war progressed and military budgets were strained, the revenue generated by these camps became increasingly important to Western commanders operating with limited resources. Financial records from several forts show that proceeds from these operations were used to supplement official budgets for everything from weapons maintenance to officers' quarters improvements. Professor Blackhawk notes, in a perverse way, these women's bodies became war resources. Their exploitation generated funds that supported military operations during a time of national crisis. This financial incentive helps explain why the system expanded and why there was institutional resistance to its exposure even after the war ended. The end of the Civil War brought increased federal attention to Western territories, but did not immediately lead to the camp's exposure. Instead, as correspondence in the Westfield papers shows, there was a coordinated effort to dismantle the physical evidence while maintaining the silence surrounding their existence. A letter from Colonel Westfield, dated July 1866, reads, "With congressional committees now actively inspecting Western operations, all remaining special facilities must be immediately repurposed or demolished. Any indigenous females still under supervision should be transferred to reservations or placed with settler families as domestic help or wives. Personnel involved should understand that discussing these matters could result in court-martial under charges of spreading falsehoods damaging to the military's reputation." This active suppression explains why this history remained largely absent from official records and academic histories for over a century. The women who survived these camps often had no platform to share their experiences, and when they did speak, their accounts were frequently dismissed as unreliable by historical institutions that privileged written documentation over oral testimony. Sarah Whitefeather explains, "In indigenous communities, these stories were passed down through generations despite the silence from official sources. Grandmothers told granddaughters about what had happened, creating an alternative historical record that preserved the truth when written histories failed to do so. This oral tradition kept the memory alive until documentary evidence finally emerged to corroborate these accounts. The human toll of these camps extended far beyond the immediate physical and psychological trauma inflicted on the women held there. The impacts rippled outward, affecting families, communities, and future generations in ways that continue to resonate today. Mary Runninghawk speaks to these intergenerational effects. "My great-grandmother's experience in the camp affected how she raised her children, how those children raised their children, and so on down to the present. The trauma became embedded in family patterns, fear of authority figures, mistrust of government institutions, certain protective behaviors that made sense in light of what she had experienced, but shaped our family for generations. Understanding this history helps explain patterns in our communities that might otherwise be misinterpreted. This perspective aligns with contemporary understanding of historical trauma and its intergenerational transmission in indigenous communities. The sexual violence of the camps represented one facet of a multidimensional assault on Native American societies, contributing to cultural disruption that continues to manifest in health disparities, social challenges, and psychological impacts documented by public health researchers. Dr. Elizabeth Talchief observes, "When we look at contemporary issues facing Native American communities, elevated rates of sexual violence, distrust of government institutions, specific patterns of psychological distress, we're seeing, in part, the long shadow of historical traumas like these camps. Healing requires acknowledging these connections between historical events and present conditions. The process of bringing this history to light has faced significant obstacles. Beyond the deliberate destruction of records, there have been institutional and cultural barriers to acknowledgement. Some military historians have questioned the extent and systematic nature of these camps, suggesting they might have been isolated incidents rather than a coordinated program, despite evidence to the contrary. Dr. Jenkins notes, "There's been a form of historical defensiveness that's all too common when confronting difficult aspects of American history. Some colleagues have invested enormous energy in trying to minimize this history rather than engaging with the evidence objectively. This resistance itself reveals how threatening these revelations are to certain narratives about American history and identity. This resistance extends beyond academic circles. When exhibitions or educational programs have attempted to include this history, they have sometimes faced political pressure to downplay or exclude it. Museum professionals and educators report challenges in presenting this material, particularly in regions where military institutions have significant cultural and economic influence. Professor Blackhawk explains, "There's a profound discomfort with acknowledging that systematic sexual exploitation of Indigenous women was conducted under military auspices. It contradicts cherished narratives about the military as a force for freedom and justice. But historical reckoning requires confronting even the most uncomfortable truths about our institutions. Despite these challenges, significant progress has been made in documenting and acknowledging this history. The National Museum of the American Indian includes references to these camps in its exhibitions on 19th-century federal Indian policy. Several tribal museums have developed more extensive presentations, often incorporating oral histories alongside newly discovered documentary evidence. Educational curricula have been slower to incorporate this history, though some universities now include it in courses on Native American history, women's history, and the Civil War era. K-12 education has been more variable, with inclusion often dependent on local decisions and the preparation of individual teachers to address such sensitive material. The legal and political implications of this history remain largely unaddressed. Unlike some other historical injustices against Native American peoples, there has been no formal acknowledgement or apology from the federal government regarding these camps. No reparations have been considered, and the issue has received limited attention from elected officials. Sarah Whitefeather reflects on this absence. When the government acknowledges historical wrongs like forced relocations or boarding schools, it at least creates a foundation for healing. The continuing silence around these camps perpetuates the original injustice. The message is that these women's experiences don't matter enough to be officially recognized, much less addressed. This silence stands in contrast to some international examples, where sexual violence in conflict has received formal acknowledgement and, in some cases, reparative action. The comfort women system operated by Imperial Japan during World War II, while different in many respects, offers one example of how historical sexual violence has been addressed elsewhere, however imperfectly. Dr. Margaret Tallbear observes, "The international framework for addressing conflict-related sexual violence has evolved significantly in recent decades. Historical cases like the comfort women have received formal acknowledgement, memorialization, and in some instances, compensation. The U.S. has supported such processes internationally while failing to apply similar principles to its own historical conduct toward Indigenous women. For the descendants of women who survived these camps, the process of reconciling with this history is deeply personal and complex. Many describe a mix of emotions: grief for what their ancestors endured, anger at the systems that enabled and then concealed this abuse, and a certain validation in having family histories finally acknowledged as truth rather than dismissed as unverifiable. Mary Runninghawk shares, "When I first read the Westfield papers and saw written proof of what my great-grandmother had described, I wept for hours. There was a painful validation in seeing her truth confirmed, but also a reopening of wounds. Understanding this history helps explain certain patterns in our family. Fears that seemed irrational make perfect sense in light of what she experienced. There's a form of healing in that understanding. though the pain doesn't disappear. This complex legacy extends to communities and nations. For many tribal communities, the emergence of this history has prompted difficult but important conversations about historical trauma, gender violence, and cultural resilience. It has created spaces for addressing patterns of silence around sexual violence that sometimes developed as protective responses to historical experiences. Sarah Whitefeather notes, in some communities, there's been a powerful reclaiming of voice around these issues. Women are speaking about experiences that went unacknowledged for generations. There's a recognition that breaking silences, both historical and contemporary, is essential for healing. These conversations connect historical experiences to contemporary challenges. Native American women continue to face disproportionate rates of sexual violence, with the Department of Justice reporting that more than 1 in 3 Indigenous women experience rape or attempted rape in their lifetime, a rate more than twice the national average. Understanding the historical roots of this violence provides important context for addressing present-day disparities. Dr. Elizabeth Tallchief explains, the camps were part of a historical pattern that devalued Indigenous women's bodies and autonomy. That pattern didn't disappear when the camps were dismantled. It evolved into new forms across generations. Addressing contemporary violence requires understanding these historical continuities. This connection between past and present underscores the contemporary relevance of this historical research. It's not merely about documenting what happened in the 1860s, but about understanding patterns that continue to shape lived experiences and institutional responses today. The search for additional documentation continues, with researchers examining military records, personal papers, regional archives, and other potential sources that might contain overlooked evidence. Each new discovery adds detail to our understanding of how extensively these operations were spread across the Western territories, and how many women were affected. In 2015, a significant discovery came from an unexpected source. During the digitization of medical records from Fort Laramie, archivists identified a ledger containing detailed information about women held at what was described as an auxiliary facility. The records included intake information, medical treatments, pregnancies, and in some cases, eventual disposition, whether through release, transfer to other facilities, placement with settlers, or death. Dr. Elizabeth Tallchief, who analyzed these records, observes, what's remarkable about this ledger is the level of detail it provides about individual women, their tribal affiliations, ages, physical conditions upon arrival, and subsequent medical histories. It humanizes them in a way most documents don't, giving us glimpses of their specific experiences rather than treating them as an undifferentiated group. The ledger recorded women from at least 11 different tribal nations being held at this single facility between 1863 and 1865. Ages ranged from as young as 14 to women in their 30s, with the majority between 16 and 25. Medical entries documented injuries consistent with physical and sexual abuse, multiple pregnancies, infectious diseases, and psychological symptoms described as melancholia or nervous exhaustion. Particularly revealing are entries documenting resistance. Notes about women who attempted escape, refused visitations, or engaged in other forms of opposition reveal both the agency of these women under unimaginable circumstances and the punitive responses to such resistance. Entries document women being placed in isolation, deprived of food, or subjected to other punishments for these acts of defiance. Professor Blackhawk reflects, these records of resistance are crucial for understanding these women not just as victims, but as individuals who maintained their humanity and dignity despite systematic attempts to dehumanize them. Their resistance took many forms, from escape attempts to maintaining cultural practices in secret, to simply surviving with the hope of eventual return to their communities. Baby This perspective on resistance aligns with broader reassessments of indigenous responses to colonization, which increasingly recognize the diverse and creative ways Native Americans maintained cultural continuity and personal agency, even under extreme duress. The women in these camps, like indigenous people in other contexts of oppression, found ways to resist that aren't always visible in records created by those who controlled them. Sarah Whitefeather shares, "In the oral histories I've collected, there are accounts of women in these situations maintaining cultural practices in secret, speaking their languages when alone together, singing songs from their traditions, preserving knowledge they would later bring back to their communities. These acts of cultural persistence were themselves forms of resistance against a system designed to sever their connections to their identities." The Fort Laramie Ledger also provides insights into the bureaucratic systems that facilitated these operations. Regular reports were sent to regional command, supplies were requisitioned through modified military channels, and personnel were formally assigned to the facility. This documentation reinforces understanding of these camps not as rogue operations, but as institutionally supported systems operating within modified military structures. Dr. Thomas Jenkins notes, "What's revealed in these bureaucratic details is the banality of the evil, how systematic exploitation was normalized through administrative procedures, specialized terminology, and institutional compartmentalization. It's a sobering reminder of how formal structures can facilitate and normalize profound moral failures." This normalization extended to the economic aspects of these operations. Financial records associated with the Fort Laramie facility show detailed accounting of recreational fees collected from visitors to the camp, with funds allocated to various military expenditures. These financial systems transformed sexual violence into a commodity that generated revenue for military operations, a particularly disturbing manifestation of how indigenous bodies were exploited for multiple forms of resource extraction. Dr. Robert Eaglefeather observes, "The economic dimension of these camps reflects a broader pattern in colonial relationships, where indigenous peoples and their resources, including, in this case, women's bodies, were treated as materials to be exploited for the benefit of the colonizing power. The commodification of sexual access to these women represents an extreme form of this extractive relationship. As more documents have emerged, researchers have gained deeper insight into how these operations were justified by those who established and maintained them. Personal correspondence between officers reveals the dehumanizing ideologies that facilitated such exploitation. Beliefs about indigenous women as inherently savage or promiscuous, racial theories that placed Native Americans lower on a supposed hierarchy of human development, and pragmatic military reasoning that treated sexual violence as a legitimate tool of warfare and territorial control. A letter from a Captain Thomas Reynolds to Colonel Westfield, dated March 1863, reveals these justifications. The special facilities serve multiple strategic objectives beyond the obvious morale benefits for the men. By disrupting the familial bonds of these savages and demonstrating our complete dominance even in the most intimate aspects of their existence, we undermine their will to resistance far more effectively than battlefield defeats alone could achieve. These women, once returned to their tribes, if they are returned, carry with them the lesson of our absolute power. This explicit articulation of sexual violence as a strategic tool aligns with what scholars of conflict-related sexual violence have identified in other historical and contemporary contexts. Such violence is not incidental to warfare, but often a deliberate strategy to traumatize communities, demonstrate dominance, and fracture social bonds that might otherwise sustain resistance. Professor Blackhawk explains, "What we see in these justifications is sexual violence as a weapon of war and colonization, a calculated strategy to subjugate indigenous populations through gendered violence." This perspective helps us understand these camps not as peripheral to military operations or federal Indian policy, but as implementations of those policies through gendered means. This strategic dimension connects the houses of pleasure to broader patterns of gender violence in colonial contexts globally. Comparative studies have identified similar patterns across different colonial regimes, where sexual violence against Indigenous women served both immediate functions of providing sexual access to colonizing men and broader strategic purposes of demonstrating dominance, disrupting Indigenous social structures, and facilitating territorial control. Dr. Margaret Tallbear notes, when we place these camps in a global context of colonial gender violence, we see that they weren't exceptional but representative of how colonial powers have weaponized sexual violence against Indigenous women across different times and places. This comparative perspective helps us understand them as manifestations of structural violence rather than isolated moral failures. As this history has become more fully documented, it has prompted reassessment of conventional narratives about the Civil War era and westward expansion. The camps represent a significant but previously unacknowledged aspect of how federal authority was extended into Western territories during this period, and how Indigenous resistance was undermined through targeted gender violence. Dr. Jenkins observes, this history complicates triumphalist narratives of both the Civil War as a straightforward moral crusade for freedom and Western expansion as an inevitable march of progress. It reveals how, even as the nation fought over slavery in the South, it was establishing different forms of unfreedom in the West, forms that targeted Indigenous women in specific and devastating ways. This reassessment has implications for how we understand not just the specific history of these camps, but the broader processes of nation-building and territorial control in 19th-century America. It reveals gendered dimensions of colonization that have often been overlooked in historical accounts focused primarily on military campaigns, land transfers, and formal political relationships. For Indigenous communities, the ongoing process of documenting this history represents both a painful reckoning with historical trauma and an opportunity for truth-telling that honors the experiences of ancestors who were silenced. It provides context for understanding contemporary challenges and affirms the resilience of communities that have survived multiple and overlapping forms of historical violence. Mary Runninghawk reflects, knowing this history doesn't erase the pain, but it helps explain the journey our communities have been on. These women survived unimaginable conditions, and many found ways to return to their people, carrying both trauma and strength. Their resilience is part of why we're still here as nations and communities. Honoring their experiences means both acknowledging the violence they endured and celebrating the survival that allowed me to be here telling their stories. This perspective on resilience and survival represents an important counterbalance to narratives that might otherwise focus exclusively on victimization. While acknowledging the profound trauma inflicted through these camps, Indigenous communities and scholars also emphasize the agency and resistance of the women who endured them and the cultural persistence that allowed communities to maintain identity and continuity despite such targeted violence. Sarah Whitefeather explains, these women were victims of systematic violence, but they were never only victims. They were also resistors, survivors, and in many cases, culture bearers who brought knowledge and practices back to communities that had been fragmented by multiple forms of displacement and violence. Recognizing their complete humanity means acknowledging both what was done to them and how they responded to it with courage and determination. As awareness of this history has grown, it has influenced contemporary efforts to address violence against Indigenous women. Organizations working on issues like missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, MMIWG, and sexual violence in Native American communities draw connections between historical patterns of exploitation and contemporary vulnerabilities. Dr. Elizabeth Tallchief notes, historical context doesn't explain away contemporary violence, but it helps us understand the structures and attitudes that make Indigenous women particularly vulnerable. When federal authorities today still fail to adequately investigate or prosecute crimes against Native women, we're seeing echoes of historical patterns where violence against these women wasn't taken seriously. This connection between historical and contemporary concerns has informed policy proposals ranging from improved data collection on violence against Indigenous women to expanded tribal jurisdiction over crimes committed on tribal lands. Advocates argue that addressing contemporary disparities requires acknowledging their historical roots and implementing solutions that account for this context. The emerging documentation of the houses of pleasure has also influenced artistic and cultural responses that aim to process this difficult history. Indigenous writers, filmmakers, visual artists, and performers have created works that engage with this history, often focusing on aspects of resistance, survival, and healing, rather than solely on victimization. Playwright Jennifer Redhawk's 2019 work Returning tells the story of a woman who survives one of these camps and eventually makes her way back to her community. Rather than focusing primarily on the violence she experienced, the play centers on her journey of returning, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, and how she rebuilds connections that the camp system had attempted to sever. Redhawk explains her approach. I wanted to acknowledge the violence without letting it define these women's entire existence. The camps tried to reduce them to their bodies, to objects for exploitation. Focusing only on that violence risks continuing that reduction. I wanted to show a full human being navigating the aftermath, finding her way back to herself and her people, despite everything designed to prevent that return. This emphasis on survival and return reflects broader trends in how Indigenous communities and artists engage with difficult histories, acknowledging trauma while centering resilience, resistance, and cultural continuity. It represents a rejection of narratives that define Indigenous peoples primarily through their experiences of victimization rather than through their ongoing presence and persistence. As historical research continues, new dimensions of this history regularly emerge. Recent work has begun to explore connections between the houses of pleasure and other systems that targeted Indigenous women during this period, including early iterations of what would later become the boarding school system and programs that placed Indigenous women as domestic workers in white households. Professor Blackhawk explains, these various systems operated with different specific methods, but shared broader goals of disrupting Indigenous family structures, separating women from their communities, and imposing forms of control that undermined tribal sovereignty through gendered means. Understanding these connections helps us see how multiple institutional forms work together in the broader project of colonial control. Sinan, this perspective places the camps within a continuum of policies and practices targeting Indigenous women rather than seeing them as isolated phenomena. It reveals how sexual violence operated alongside other forms of control as part of a multidimensional assault on Indigenous communities and cultures. For contemporary Americans confronting this history, the process involves difficult reckonings with national narratives and identities. It requires acknowledging that respected institutions like the U.S. military have histories that include systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations, histories that have been deliberately obscured to maintain positive institutional images. Dr. Jenkins reflects, as a military historian and former officer, engaging with this history has been professionally and personally challenging. It requires acknowledging that an institution I respected has a history that includes systematic sexual exploitation of Indigenous women. But historical honesty demands confronting even the most difficult aspects of our institutional pasts. This process of historical reckoning extends beyond academic circles to communities, institutions, and individuals trying to understand how such histories should inform contemporary relationships and responsibilities. It raises questions about what meaningful acknowledgement, apology, and repair might look like nearly 160 years after these events. Sarah Whitefeather observes, "True healing requires more than just documenting what happened. It requires formal acknowledgement from the institutions responsible, material commitments to addressing ongoing impacts, and changes in how we teach this history to future generations. We're still at the beginning of that process. For the descendants of women who experience these camps, the journey of understanding and healing is deeply personal. Many describe complex processes of integrating this knowledge into their family histories and making sense of intergenerational patterns that suddenly appear in a new light." Mary Runninghawk shares, "Learning about what my great-grandmother endured changed how I understand myself and my family. Behaviors that seemed strange or dysfunctional make perfect sense as responses to profound trauma. There's a certain healing in that understanding, though it comes with its own pain. Knowledge doesn't erase the wounds, but it helps explain them." During this integration of historical knowledge into personal and family understanding reflects broader processes of healing from historical trauma that many Indigenous communities are engaged in. Such healing involves acknowledging what happened, understanding its impacts across generations, and reclaiming cultural practices and knowledge systems that colonial violence sought to destroy. As this difficult history continues to be uncovered and acknowledged, it presents both challenges and opportunities. The challenges lie in confronting painful truths about American history and institutions, integrating those truths into national narratives that have often excluded Indigenous experiences, and determining what justice and healing might look like so many generations after the original events. The opportunities lie in the potential for more honest relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Americans based on shared understanding of historical realities, for institutional reforms informed by acknowledgement of past failures, and for healing processes that address the continuing impacts of historical trauma. Professor Blackhawk reflects, "Bringing this history to light isn't about assigning guilt to contemporary individuals or institutions. It's about creating a more complete and honest understanding of how we got here, how historical patterns of exploitation and erasure have shaped current realities. Only with that understanding can we build different kinds of relationships and systems going forward." This perspective frames historical reckoning not as an end in itself, but as a foundation for creating more just and equitable relationships in the present and future. It suggests that acknowledging even the most difficult aspects of shared history is necessary for meaningful reconciliation and healing. As we continue to uncover and process this long-suppressed chapter of American history, we confront fundamental questions about national identity, historical memory, and collective responsibility. The story of the Houses of Pleasure challenges comfortable narratives about American progress and innocence. It reveals that even in moments celebrated for moral clarity, like the Civil War's struggle against slavery, other forms of exploitation were being established and institutionalized. Sarah Whitefeather offers a perspective on moving forward with this difficult knowledge. The healing doesn't come from forgetting or minimizing what happened. It comes from finally telling the truth, from honoring these women by acknowledging their experiences, and from committing to create a world where such things can never happen again. The first step is simply to hear and believe these stories that were silenced for far too long. This commitment to truth-telling as a foundation for healing aligns with Indigenous approaches to justice that emphasize acknowledging harm, taking responsibility, and restoring right relationships rather than focusing primarily on punishment. It suggests a path forward that honors the experiences of those who suffered while creating possibilities for different kinds of relationships in the present and future. As we close this examination of one of America's most disturbing and long-suppressed historical chapters, we're left with both greater understanding and new questions. The systematic exploitation of Indigenous women in the Houses of Pleasure represents a painful truth about how the nation extended control over Western territories during the Civil War era. a truth that challenges conventional narratives and demands integration into our collective historical memory. The women who endured these camps, who survived and in many cases found ways to return to their communities despite everything designed to prevent that return, deserve to have their experiences acknowledged as part of American history. Their stories, preserved through oral tradition when written records were deliberately destroyed, reveal both the depths of colonial violence and the extraordinary resilience of Indigenous women and communities. As we reckon with this difficult knowledge, may we find ways to honor these women's experiences through honest acknowledgement, meaningful commemoration, and commitments to address the continuing impacts of historical trauma in Indigenous communities. And may we create educational and historical practices that tell more complete truths about our shared past, however uncomfortable those truths may be. For it is only through facing our history honestly, acknowledging both achievements and atrocities, moments of moral courage and instances of profound failure, that we can create more just and truthful relationships in the present. The women of the houses of pleasure, sharpshooters, silenced for generations, speak to us now across time. The question is whether we have the courage to truly listen and allow their testimonies to change how we understand our shared history. As we contemplate these difficult truths about our nation's past, let us remember the biblical admonition that the truth shall make you free. Only by confronting even the most painful chapters of our history can we hope to create a future based on honest reckoning rather than comfortable myths. May God grant us the courage to face these truths, the wisdom to learn from them, and the commitment to create a world where the dignity of every human being is recognized and protected. And may the women who endured these camps find, at last, the acknowledgement and rest they were long denied. Amen.
At 0900 on September 27, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel William Whaling stood at the edge of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, watching 4 Marines carry a stretcher toward the aid station. 22 years old, 3rd patrol this week, dead before they found the Japanese position. 3 more stretchers followed. The jungle had swallowed a 7-man patrol that morning. Only 4 came back. The Japanese owned the jungle. 2 months into the Guadalcanal campaign, Marine patrols walked into ambushes they never saw coming. 17 patrols had been wiped out in 3 weeks. The Japanese moved through dense vegetation like ghosts. Marines trained for frontal assaults could not see an enemy soldier 10 feet away. Enemy snipers picked off officers. Machine gun nests stayed hidden until entire squads walked past, then opened fire from behind. Whaling knew this pattern would kill them all. The 1st Marine Division had lost 400 men to Japanese ambushes in September alone. Standard infantry tactics did not work in jungle warfare. Marines needed something different, something the Japanese did not expect. 2 days earlier, Whaling had been relieved of his command as executive officer of the 5th Marine Regiment. No combat failure, just personality conflicts with his commanding officer. Most officers in his position would have been shipped back to the United States, but Colonel Gerald Thomas, the Divisional Chief of Staff, knew Whaling's reputation. World War I veteran, Silver Star at San Miguel, expert marksman who competed in the 1924 Olympics. Most importantly, Whaling understood fieldcraft better than any officer in the division. Thomas kept him on Guadalcanal, told him to think about their jungle problem. Whaling spent 3 days watching patrols leave and counting how many returned. The mathematics were brutal. At this rate, the division would run out of infantrymen before the Japanese ran out of jungle. He needed men who could hunt the hunters, men who understood stalking, men who could read terrain and move silently, men who could kill without being seen. On September 29th, Whaling walked into General Alexander Vandegrift's command tent with a proposal. Organized a scout sniper unit, 100 volunteers, hand-picked from Marines with hunting backgrounds, outdoorsmen, skilled marksmen. Train them in reconnaissance and ambush tactics. Send them into the jungle in small teams to gather intelligence and eliminate Japanese positions before regular patrols advanced. Vandegrift approved immediately. The general had studied Lieutenant Colonel Robert Rogers and his Ranger tactics from the French and Indian War. Small, mobile units operating independently behind enemy lines. The idea fit perfectly with their desperate situation on Guadalcanal. Whaling had 1 week to find his men and start training. If you want to see how Whaling built the deadliest unit in the Pacific, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories with more people. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Whaling. He started reading service records that night, looking for specific markers: expert rifle qualification, rural backgrounds, hunting experience, disciplinary records that showed independence, not cowardice, men who thought for themselves, the kind of Marines who got in trouble for questioning orders but always completed the mission. By October 1st, Whaling had identified 43 candidates. He called them to a briefing at 0600 on October 2nd, told them the assignment was voluntary, told them the casualty rate for reconnaissance work ran above 50%, told them they would operate in teams of 2 or 3, sometimes for days behind Japanese lines. No backup, no extraction if things went wrong. 41 volunteered immediately. 2 walked away. Whaling looked at the men standing in front of him. Most were 20 years old or younger. Half had been in combat less than 2 months, but they had something the regular infantry did not. They wanted to hunt, and Whaling was about to teach them how to become the most feared unit the Japanese would face in the Pacific War. His training would create a template. 2 years later, another Marine officer would use Whaling's methods to build an even more notorious unit. That officer would add one unusual requirement to his recruitment process, a requirement that would shock the entire Marine Corps and create a legend that lasted 80 years. Whaling started training on October 3rd. No manuals existed for what he was building. The Marine Corps had disbanded its Scout Sniper program after World War I. Everything Whaling knew came from experience. 24 years in the Corps, jungle patrol in Nicaragua, French battlefields where he learned that invisible soldiers lived longer than brave ones. The first lesson was silence. Whaling took his volunteers into the jungle west of Henderson Field and told them to walk 100 yards without making noise. Every man failed. Equipment rattled. Boots cracked branches. Canteens clinked against rifles. The jungle amplified every sound. He made them do it again. Removed everything that made noise. Taped down metal parts. Wrapped cloth around canteen hooks. Walked in soft-soled boots instead of standard issue. After 3 days, half the men could move through dense vegetation without alerting Japanese positions 200 yards away. Marksmanship came next. Most Marines could hit targets at 300 yards on a rifle range, but rifle ranges did not have wind, or rain, or targets that shot back. Whaling taught them to estimate distance by terrain features, judge wind by watching vegetation, account for how humidity affected bullet trajectory. He made them fire from uncomfortable positions, uphill, downhill, lying in mud, crouched behind cover that barely concealed them. By October 10th, his best shooters could kill Japanese soldiers at 400 yards with iron sights. The hard part was teaching them to think differently. Regular Marine infantry worked in squads of 12 men, clear chain of command. Orders flowed down from officers. Initiative was discouraged. Whaling needed the opposite. Teams of 2 or 3 operating independently for days, making tactical decisions without asking permission. Soldiers who could adapt when plans failed. He trained them in map reading and terrain analysis, how to identify good ambush positions, how to sketch enemy fortifications, how to estimate troop strength from campfire smoke and foot traffic, skills that regular infantry never learned, because officers did that thinking for them. On October 13th, Whaling received orders from General Vandegrift. The division was planning an offensive across the Matanikaw River. Japanese forces had dug in on the western side. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Artillery positions sat hidden in jungle canopy. Regular patrols kept getting slaughtered trying to find them. Vandegrift wanted Whaling to take his partially trained unit and locate Japanese positions before the offensive started. Whaling picked 8 men, split them into 4 teams, gave each team a sector to scout, told them to avoid contact if possible, gather intelligence, and return. If they got pinned down, they were on their own. no rescue missions. The division could not afford to lose more men looking for lost scouts. The first team left at 0400 on October 14th. 2 Marines, both from Montana. Both grew up hunting elk in mountain forests. They moved west along the Matanakaw River for 3 hours, found a Japanese artillery position at 0715. 4 Type 92 howitzers hidden under camouflage netting. 60 soldiers. They sketched the position, counted ammunition crates, and returned by noon. The second team found a machine gun nest overlooking a river crossing. The third team mapped Japanese patrol routes. The fourth team ran into trouble. They were mapping a trail network when a Japanese patrol appeared. 5 soldiers, 50 yards away. The 2 Marines froze, waited for the patrol to pass. But one Japanese soldier stalked, looked directly at the position where the Marines hid in vegetation, raised his rifle. The Marine closest to him fired first. Single shot. The Japanese soldier dropped. His 4 companions scattered, started shouting. Within 30 seconds, whistles echoed through the jungle, enemy troops converging on the sound. The 2 Marines ran, headed east toward Marine lines. Japanese soldiers followed. The chase lasted 40 minutes. The Marines reached friendly positions with 11 enemy soldiers 200 yards behind them, but they brought back critical intelligence. Whaling now had detailed maps of Japanese positions along a 2-mile front, information that regular patrols had failed to gather in 2 months of trying, information that cost dozens of Marine lives. General Vandegrift looked at the maps on October 15th and immediately changed his offensive plan. Instead of a frontal assault, he would use the scout teams to guide flanking maneuvers around Japanese strongpoints. Whaling's unit had proven the concept worked. Now Vandegrift wanted more. He told Whaling to expand, find another 60 volunteers, form a full company, and prepare for the largest Marine offensive of the Guadalcanal campaign. The battle for the Matanakaw was coming, and Whaling's scout snipers would lead the way into the deadliest jungle fighting the Pacific War had seen. The Matanakaw offensive began at 0600 on October 6, 1942. Whaling scouts moved out 30 minutes before the main assault. Their mission was simple: infiltrate Japanese lines, locate command posts and artillery positions, eliminate officers and radio operators, create chaos before Marine infantry crossed the river. Whaling organized his scouts into a special task force, combined them with 3rd Battalion 2nd Marines. The unit was officially called the Composite Battalion. Everyone else called it the Whaling Group. They crossed the Matanakaw River 3 miles upstream from Japanese positions, moved through jungle so dense that visibility dropped to 20 feet. No trails, no maps, just compass bearings and intuition. By 0800, they had penetrated 2 miles behind Japanese lines without being detected. The first engagement happened at 0920. A Whaling Group scout team spotted a Japanese command post, tent with radio equipment, 6 officers studying maps, 15 soldiers providing security. The scouts waited until officers gathered for a briefing, then opened fire from 200 yards, killed 4 officers in the first volley. The remaining Japanese soldiers scattered into jungle, never found who shot them. 30 minutes later, another scout team eliminated a forward observer calling artillery strikes on Marine positions. Single shot from 300 yards. The observer dropped. Artillery fire stopped. Marine infantry advanced 600 yards before Japanese gunners realized their spotter was dead. By noon, Whaling Group had encircled Japanese positions west of the Matanakaw. Regular Marine battalions attacked from the east while scouts cut off retreat routes. Japanese forces found themselves trapped between 2 forces. No escape, no reinforcements. The fighting lasted 4 days. Between October 6th and October 9th, approximately 750 Japanese soldiers died in the encirclement. The 4th Infantry Regiment effectively ceased to exist as a combat unit. Marine casualties were lighter than any previous offensive: 43 killed, 112 wounded. General Vandegrift credited the scout snipers with changing the tactical situation. Small teams gathering intelligence, eliminating key targets, disrupting command and control. The Japanese had not expected Marines to fight like this. Expected frontal assaults, not infiltration and ambush. Whaling's methods worked, but they came with a price. On October 8th, Whaling took shrapnel from a mortar round. Nothing critical, just enough to put him in a field hospital for observation. Infection set in 3 days later. By October 15th, fever forced evacuation to a hospital ship. He spent the next 4 months recovering, missed the rest of the Guadalcanal campaign, but his program survived. The 1st Marine Division formally established scout sniper platoons in each infantry regiment. Headquarters Company got a dedicated reconnaissance section. Training became standardized. Selection criteria formalized. Everything Whaling created from scratch in September became official Marine Corps doctrine by December. The division awarded him the Legion of Merit in February 1944. Citation read that he organized a scout sniper detachment and supervised training of selected groups in scouting, stalking, and ambush tactics. That his instruction and expert knowledge of jungle warfare contributed immeasurably to success achieved by Marine patrols. Whaling never returned to Guadalcanal. Took command of 1st Marine Regiment in Australia, led them at Cape Gloucester. Eventually commanded 29th Marines on Okinawa, where he earned the Navy Cross. Retired as a Major General in 1954. But his real legacy was not medals. It was a concept, a template for how Marines could fight differently. His program became the foundation for all Marine scout sniper operations.
Through World War II, Korea, Vietnam, every conflict where Marines needed eyes in places regular infantry could not go. 2 years after Whaling created his program, another Marine officer read his after-action reports, studied his training methods, decided to build something even more aggressive, an elite platoon that would take Whaling's ideas and add one controversial twist. This officer did not want disciplined Marines. He wanted fighters, troublemakers, men who won brawls and ended up in the brig. He was about to create the most legendary scout sniper unit of the Pacific War. At 0700 on January 15, 1944, First Lieutenant Frank Tuchovsky walked through the brig at Marine Corps Base Camp Tarawa in Hawaii. 29 years old, combat veteran of Guadalcanal and Tarawa, looking for the worst Marines in the 2nd Marine Division. He found them. 18 men locked in cells for fighting. Assault charges, insubordination, destruction of property, the kind of disciplinary problems that got Marines dishonorably discharged. Tuchovsky was not there to punish them. He was there to recruit them. 3 months earlier, Colonel James Risley had given Tuchovsky an unusual order. Form an elite scout sniper platoon for the 6th Marine Regiment. Model it after British commandos. Train 40 men in reconnaissance and long-range killing. But do not recruit from regular infantry. Risley wanted something different. He wanted men who could not follow orders, men who thought for themselves, men who would survive behind enemy lines where rulebook tactics got you killed. Tuchovsky understood the assignment. He had read William Whaling's after-action reports from Guadalcanal, studied how small teams of scouts disrupted Japanese operations. But Whaling had recruited hunters and outdoorsmen, disciplined men who happened to have fieldcraft skills. Tuchovsky wanted the opposite. He wanted fighters. His selection criteria was simple. Find Marines who won fights and ended up in the brig. Ignore the losers who went to the infirmary. He explained his logic to skeptical officers. When 2 Marines fight, one wins and one loses. The loser goes to sickbay. The winner goes to the brig for assault. Standard Marine justice punished the wrong man. The winner proved he could handle himself, proved he would not quit when things got violent. That was the Marine Tuchovsky wanted on his team. The brig commander thought he was insane, told him these men were troublemakers, criminals, the worst discipline cases in the division. Tuchovsky said that was exactly what he needed. Over 3 weeks, Tuchovsky interviewed 47 Marines with disciplinary records, asked them why they fought, what they did before joining the Corps, whether they could kill a man silently with a knife. 23 volunteered. Another 17 came from regular infantry, Marines with expert marksman ratings who had proven themselves at Tarawa. By February 1st, Tucholsky had his 40 men, called them the Scout Sniper Platoon of the 6th Marine Regiment. The nickname came later, after they started stealing everything not bolted down on the big island of Hawaii. Training began in the jungle highlands near Hilo. Tucholsky used Whaling's methods as a foundation: silent movement, long-range marksmanship, map reading. Then added hand-to-hand combat training, knife fighting, garrote techniques, how to kill sentries without making noise. British commando tactics adapted for Pacific jungle warfare. The platoon learned to live off the land, hunt wild boar, catch fish, identify edible plants. Survival skills for operating behind enemy lines where resupply was impossible. They trained with piano wire garrotes, learned how to roll the wire in glue and crushed glass. One Marine named Wild Bill Emmerich became infamous for rescuing wounded men from kill zones using nothing but a garrote and silence. Equipment was a problem.
The Marine Corps issued them World War I-era Springfield rifles. Outdated rations. No proper camouflage. So they stole better gear, raided Army supply depots at night, took newer weapons, stole canned food and whiskey, even stole an Army captain's Jeep and repainted it marine green. If you want to see how these 40 thieves earned their nickname on Saipan, please hit that like button. Every like helps us share more forgotten stories. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to the thieves. The stealing became legendary. Other Marine units called them the 40 Thieves, not as an insult, as respect. These men operated outside normal military constraints, took what they needed to survive. Officers looked the other way because Tucholsky was building something unprecedented, a unit that could hunt Japanese soldiers in their own territory. By May 1944, the 40 Thieves were ready. Saipan was coming. 15 square miles of volcanic rock and jungle, 30,000 Japanese defenders. The first invasion of Japanese home territory. High Command expected 70% casualties in the first week. The Thieves would go in first. Days before the main landing, their mission was simple: scout enemy positions, map defenses, kill officers, and survive long enough to guide the assault force through the bloodiest invasion of the Pacific War. At 0530 on June 15, 1944, Corporal Bill Knuppel crouched in a Higgins boat 300 yards off Saipan's western shore. 21 years old, member of the 40 Thieves, watching naval bombardment tear apart the beach ahead. The noise was unbelievable. 16-inch guns from battleships, 5-inch destroyer batteries, rockets from landing craft. The entire shoreline disappeared under smoke and fire. The Japanese were waiting anyway. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions hit the beach at 0840. 8,000 Marines in the first wave. Japanese artillery opened fire immediately. Mortars, machine guns, artillery zeroed on landing zones. Marines died before they left their boats. Bodies floated in surf. Wounded men drowned in 3 feet of water. The 40 Thieves landed in the 4th wave. Their mission was different from regular infantry. While line companies fought for the beaches, Tucholsky's platoon moved inland, looking for Japanese command posts, artillery positions, supply dumps, targets that regular Marines would not reach for days. By noon, the Thieves had penetrated half a mile inland, found themselves in dense sugarcane fields where visibility dropped to 10 feet. Perfect terrain for ambush. Japanese soldiers hid everywhere, in caves, underground bunkers, spider holes covered with vegetation. The first silent kill happened at 1300 hours. 2 thieves were scouting a trail when they spotted a Japanese radio operator, alone, setting up antenna wire. They approached from behind. Piano wire garrote. The operator died without making a sound. They took his maps and radio codes, left his body hidden in sugarcane. 2 hours later, another team eliminated a 3-man observation post. Knives. No gunfire. Japanese officers never knew their forward observers were dead. Artillery fire became uncoordinated. Marines advanced through gaps in defensive fire. This was what Tucholsky had trained them for. Silent killing. Operating independently. Making tactical decisions without orders.
The thieves moved through Japanese-controlled territory like ghosts. Regular infantry fought set-piece battles. The thieves hunted. On June 16th, Tucholsky led a patrol to scout Mount Tipo Palais, a volcanic peak in central Saipan. Intelligence reports said Japanese forces used the mountain as an observation post. Someone up there was calling artillery strikes on Marine positions. Tucholsky needed to find them. The patrol climbed through jungle so thick they used machetes, reached the base of Mount Tipo Palais at 0900, found a trail leading up the slope, fresh footprints, bicycle tracks. The Japanese were using bicycles to move supplies and troops down the mountain. Tucholsky positioned his best snipers along the trail, 5 men with Springfield rifles mounted with uninertal scopes, told them to wait for targets. By noon, Japanese soldiers started descending on bicycles. Officers, couriers, supply runners. They made easy targets. The thieves killed 14 men that afternoon, never fired more than 1 shot per target, never gave away their position. The Japanese response was predictable. They sent a patrol to find the snipers. 40 soldiers, moving uphill toward thief positions. Tucholsky pulled his men back before contact, melted into jungle. The Japanese patrol found nothing but empty firing positions and dead bodies. That night, Tucholsky received new orders. Division intelligence had located a Japanese ammunition depot near Garapan, Saipan's capital city. Command wanted the thieves to scout the depot and report on security, possibly destroy it if the opportunity presented itself. The mission was suicide. Garapan sat 2 miles behind Japanese lines. Thousands of enemy soldiers between Marine positions and the city. No support, no backup. If something went wrong, the thieves would be on their own. Tucholsky picked 8 men, best fighters in the platoon, told them they would leave at 0200 on June 17th, move through Japanese lines under darkness, scout the depot, return before dawn. He did not tell them about the intelligence report he had read that afternoon, the report that said Japanese commanders had ordered their troops to take no prisoners, that wounded Marines were being used as bait to ambush rescue parties, that the enemy was preparing for a final banzai charge that would throw every available soldier at Marine lines. The thieves were walking into hell, and they would not come back the same men who left. The 8-man patrol left Marine lines at 0200 on June 17th. No moon. Complete darkness. They moved west through sugarcane fields toward Garapan. Every 50 yards they stopped, listened. The jungle was never silent on Saipan. Japanese patrols moved constantly. Artillery rumbled in the distance. Wounded men screamed in no man's land between the lines. By 0330, the thieves had covered a mile, crossed 2 Japanese patrol routes without being detected. Sergeant Bill Knuppel led the way, reading terrain by feel, stopping whenever he sensed movement ahead. The rest of the patrol followed in single file, 10-foot intervals. No talking, hand signals only. They reached the outskirts of Garapan at 0415. The city had been flattened by naval bombardment, buildings reduced to rubble, streets cratered, but infrastructure remained. The thieves could see Japanese soldiers moving through ruins, supply trucks, communication lines. This was still a functioning military base despite the destruction. The ammunition depot sat on the northern edge of town, 3 concrete bunkers surrounded by barbed wire, guards at each entrance. Tucholsky counted 16 soldiers visible, probably more inside. His orders were to scout and report, not engage. But he saw an opportunity. The bunkers had ventilation shafts, narrow openings in the concrete, large enough for a satchel charge. If they could place explosives without being detected, they could destroy the entire depot, eliminate tons of Japanese ammunition, cripple enemy artillery for days. He made the decision. 2 men would approach the nearest bunker, plant charges. The rest would provide covering fire if things went wrong. They would detonate at 0500, then run like hell back to Marine lines before Japanese forces realized what happened.
Corporal Roscoe Mullins and Private Otto Hebel volunteered. Both had engineering experience. Both understood demolitions. They moved toward the bunker at 0430, crawled the last 100 yards. Took 20 minutes to reach the ventilation shaft. Japanese guards walked patrol routes 30 feet away. Mullins waited until a guard turned his back, then lifted the satchel charge to the ventilation opening, wedged it inside, set the timer for 15 minutes, pulled back slowly. They were 10 yards from the bunker when a guard spotted them. The Japanese soldier shouted, raised his rifle. Mullins fired first. The guard dropped, but his shout had alerted the entire depot. Whistles echoed through ruins. Soldiers poured out of buildings. The thieves opened fire from their position 200 yards away, covering Mullins and Hebel while they ran. The satchel charge detonated at 0457, 3 minutes early. The explosion tore through the bunker. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition inside ignited. Artillery shells, mortar rounds, small arms ammunition. The entire depot chain reacted. Explosions continued for 5 minutes. The sky turned orange. Debris rained down across Garapan. The thieves used the chaos to escape, ran east through sugarcane fields, while Japanese forces tried to contain fires and evacuate remaining ammunition. By 0600, they had crossed back into Marine lines. All 8 men, no casualties. They had destroyed the largest ammunition depot in northern Saipan. Division intelligence estimated the explosion eliminated 30% of Japanese artillery ammunition. Enemy fire dropped significantly over the next 2 days. Marine casualties decreased, the advance accelerated. But the mission had consequences. Japanese commanders realized Marine scout units were operating behind their lines. They increased patrols, set ambushes, started using wounded Marines as bait. Any Marine caught alone faced immediate execution. The rules of warfare on Saipan changed after Garapan. On June 19th, a thief patrol walked into an ambush near Mount Tipo Palais. 4 men, scouting a trail network. Japanese soldiers had positioned themselves in trees and underground positions, waited until the patrol was surrounded, then opened fire. The patrol leader was killed instantly. The other 3 fought their way out, wounded. 1 man took a bullet through the shoulder. Another had shrapnel in his leg. They made it back to Marine lines but brought terrible news. The Japanese had used 2 wounded Marines as bait, left them crying for help in an open clearing. When the thief patrol approached, the ambush triggered. The wounded Marines died in the crossfire. That night, the 40 thieves held an unofficial meeting. No officers present, just enlisted men. They voted unanimously. No thief would be taken alive. If wounded and unable to escape, other thieves would ensure a quick death rather than capture and torture. The war on Saipan had become personal. By June 23rd, the 40 thieves had been in continuous combat for 8 days. No rest, no rotation off the line. They operated in 12-hour shifts. Half the platoon scouting during daylight, the other half infiltrating Japanese positions at night. Sleep came in 2-hour intervals. Food was whatever they could steal or scavenge. Casualties mounted. The platoon had started with 40 men. By June 23rd, 32 remained combat effective. 3 were dead, 5 wounded badly enough for evacuation. The mathematics were simple. If combat continued at this rate, the platoon would cease to exist by July 1st. But they kept hunting. On June 24th, a 4-man team scouted Japanese positions in the Kagman Peninsula, found a battalion command post in a cave system, 20 officers, radio equipment, maps showing defensive positions across northern Saipan. The team could not assault the cave, too many guards, so they marked the position and called in artillery. Naval gunfire destroyed the cave at 1600 hours, direct hit with 14-inch shells. The entire command structure of a Japanese battalion disappeared in one strike. Enemy coordination collapsed. Marines advanced 300 yards that afternoon with minimal resistance. The next day brought the worst loss the thieves would suffer. Corporal Martin Dyer led a patrol into dense jungle near Mount Tapochau. 5 men. Mission was to scout Japanese artillery positions reported in the area. They found the artillery. 4 Type 92 guns positioned in a narrow ravine.
camouflaged with vegetation, completely hidden from aerial reconnaissance. Dyer's patrol observed the position for 30 minutes, counted crew members, noted ammunition storage locations, then began withdrawal. They were 200 yards from the artillery position when Japanese infantry appeared from 3 directions. The ambush was perfect. Machine guns opened fire from elevated positions, rifles from ground level. The patrol was caught in a kill zone with no cover. Dyer ordered his men to scatter, run for Marine lines. He stayed behind with a Browning automatic rifle, provided covering fire while his team escaped. 3 men made it out. Dyer and 1 other Marine did not. The Marine who stayed with Dyer was found later, dead from multiple gunshot wounds. Dyer's body was never recovered. Japanese forces had overrun the position before Marines could retrieve remains. The patrol survivors reported that Dyer had killed at least 7 Japanese soldiers before his position was overwhelmed. For his actions, he was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. Citation read that he sacrificed himself to ensure his patrol's survival. His leadership and courage were in keeping with the highest traditions of the Marine Corps. The thieves took Dyer's death hard. He had been popular, good leader, the kind of Marine who never asked anyone to do something he would not do himself. His loss reminded everyone that skill and training only delayed the inevitable on Saipan. Eventually, the numbers caught up. June 26th brought news that changed the tactical situation. Japanese forces were preparing for a massive banzai charge. Intelligence estimated 3,000 soldiers would attack Marine positions in a suicidal assault. Command wanted the thieves to infiltrate Japanese assembly areas, locate officers, eliminate them before the attack began. Tucholsky received orders at 2200 on June 26th. The banzai charge would likely happen within 48 hours. He had 1 night to disrupt Japanese preparations. His mission was to take 20 thieves deep behind enemy lines, find command posts, kill as many officers as possible, create chaos before the assault. It was the most dangerous mission the platoon had received. Japanese forces were consolidating, thousands of soldiers moving into attack positions. Security would be intense.
The thieves would be operating in an area saturated with enemy troops. Extraction would be nearly impossible if things went wrong. Tucholsky briefed his men at 2300, told them the odds, told them casualties would be high, asked for volunteers. All 20 men stepped forward, not because they were brave, because they understood what happened if they failed. The banzai charge would hit Marine lines with overwhelming force. Thousands of men would die, unless someone disrupted Japanese preparations first. The thieves would go. They would hunt officers in the darkness, and they would probably not all come back. The 20 thieves moved out at midnight on June 27th. No moon, heavy cloud cover, perfect conditions for infiltration. They split into 5 teams of 4 men each. Each team had a designated sector. Each team knew they were on their own if contact occurred. Tucholsky led the center team, moved west through Japanese lines toward reported command post locations. By 0200, they had penetrated a mile into enemy territory, found Japanese soldiers everywhere, sleeping in foxholes, standing guard, moving supplies. Thousands of men preparing for the assault. The first officer died at 0230. Japanese captain studying maps by lamplight inside a captured American tent. Tucholsky's team approached within 50 yards. Single shot from a suppressed Springfield. The captain dropped forward onto his maps. Guards did not even hear the shot. Over the next 3 hours, the 5 thief teams eliminated 17 Japanese officers, majors, captains, lieutenants. Command structure for the banzai charge. Each kill was silent. Each team extracted without detection. By 0530, all 20 thieves had returned to Marine lines. 0 casualties. The banzai charge came at 0400 on July 7th. 3,000 Japanese soldiers, screaming, bayonets fixed.
They hit Marine positions along a 2-mile front. The assault was ferocious. Hand-to-hand combat. Marines fought with rifles, pistols, knives, entrenching tools, anything that could kill. But the Japanese attack lacked coordination. Officers who should have directed the assault were dead. Units attacked without support. Communication broke down. What should have been an organized offensive became a chaotic charge. Marines held their positions. Artillery and machine gun fire cut down wave after wave of Japanese soldiers. By 0800, the banzai charge had failed. The Japanese lost 2,500 men. The Marine line held. The battle for Saipan effectively ended that morning. Organized Japanese resistance collapsed. Remaining enemy forces retreated to caves and prepared for final stands. The 40 thieves had done their job. Their nighttime raids disrupted Japanese command, made the difference between a coordinated assault that might have broken through and a suicidal charge that accomplished nothing. The platoon finished the Saipan campaign with 27 men, 13 casualties over 21 days of combat, 4 dead, 9 wounded. The survivors returned to Hawaii in August. The platoon was disbanded in October. Men were distributed to regular infantry units. The Marine Corps decided specialized scout sniper platoons were too expensive in casualties, but their legacy lived. Frank Tucholsky received the Silver Star. His methods influenced Marine reconnaissance doctrine for the rest of the war. The concept of small teams operating independently behind enemy lines became standard practice. What William Whaling created on Guadalcanal, the 40 thieves perfected on Saipan. Modern Marine scout snipers trace their lineage directly to these men. Whaling's training methods, Tucholsky's selection criteria, the fieldcraft, the silent killing, the independence. Every Marine sniper who has served since 1942 learned from lessons written in jungle combat on Pacific Islands. The Scout Sniper military occupational specialty was retired in December 2023, after 81 years. But the legacy remains, in reconnaissance platoons, in tactics manuals, in stories passed down through generations of Marines who learned that sometimes the deadliest warriors are invisible. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about Marines who saved lives with fieldcraft and courage. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Wild Bill Whaling and the 40 Thieves don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen. At 0630 on May 10th, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Fertig stood at the edge of a jungle clearing on Mindanao, watching columns of American and Filipino soldiers march toward Japanese prison camps. 78,000 men surrendering. Fertig was 41 years old, a mining engineer from Colorado. He had been in the Philippines for 6 years, building roads and bridges for mining companies. The Japanese had landed on Mindanao with overwhelming force. General William Sharp had just signed the surrender order for all American forces on the island. Every American soldier was expected to lay down his weapons and report to the nearest Japanese garrison. Those who refused would be hunted down and executed. Fertig knew what surrender meant. News of the Bataan Death March had already reached Mindanao through the bamboo telegraph. Thousands of American and Filipino prisoners had died on that 60-mile forced march. Men bayoneted for falling behind. Men buried alive for stopping to drink water. Men beheaded for no reason at all. The Japanese were not taking prisoners. They were taking slaves. Fertig watched the last column of surrendering soldiers disappear down the muddy road. He had a choice. Walk into a Japanese prison camp and probably die, or walk into the jungle and definitely be hunted. He turned and walked into the jungle. Mindanao was the second largest island in the Philippines, 36,000 square miles of mountains, rainforest, and swamp, larger than the state of Indiana. The Japanese controlled the coastal cities and the major roads, but the interior was a different world. Tribal villages scattered across volcanic highlands, Muslim communities in the south who had been fighting foreign invaders for 400 years, Christian Filipino farmers who hated the Japanese occupation, and somewhere in those mountains, other Americans who had also refused to surrender. Fertig had no weapons, no radio, no food, no money, no soldiers. He had only his engineering training and his knowledge of the Filipino people he had worked with for 6 years. The Japanese had 50,000 troops on Mindanao. They controlled the ports, the airfields, and the cities. They had aircraft, artillery, tanks, and naval vessels patrolling every coastline. They had a simple policy for guerrillas: capture and public execution, often by beheading, sometimes by burning alive. Within weeks of the surrender, Japanese patrols began hunting the Americans who had escaped into the jungle. They offered rewards to Filipinos who turned in Americans. They burned villages suspected of harboring fugitives. They executed entire families as examples. Fertig spent his first weeks in the jungle, sick with malaria, hiding in the camp of an old American settler named Jacob Deischer, who had lived in the Philippines since the Spanish-American War. Fertig watched Japanese prisoner columns pass on the road below. He watched Filipino civilians beaten for not bowing to Japanese soldiers. He watched a country being crushed under occupation. And he began to think about something that seemed impossible. What if the scattered Americans in the jungle could be organized? What if the Filipino resistance fighters could be unified under a single command? What if an army could be built from nothing, in the middle of enemy territory, with no supplies, no weapons, and no contact with the outside world? It was insane. Fertig knew it was insane. He was an engineer, not a combat commander. He had never led troops in battle. He had no authority to command anyone. But in July 1942, Fertig made a decision that would either save thousands of lives or get him executed as a war criminal. If you want to see how Fertig's impossible plan turned out, please hit that like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Fertig. He needed rank. In the Philippines, military authority meant everything. Filipino soldiers would not follow a lieutenant colonel when other colonels were scattered throughout the island. So Fertig did something unprecedented. He found a Filipino metalsmith. He had the man fashion 2 silver stars from old coins. And Wendell Fertig, mining engineer from Colorado, promoted himself to brigadier general. By dawn on September 12, 1942, Fertig would declare himself commander of all American forces on Mindanao. By noon, he would be the most wanted man on an island occupied by 50,000 Japanese soldiers. Fertig's first problem was legitimacy. A self-appointed general with no troops, no weapons, and no contact with MacArthur's headquarters in Australia, Filipino resistance fighters were scattered across Mindanao in dozens of independent bands. Some were former Philippine army soldiers, some were civilian volunteers, some were bandits using the war as cover for robbery, and they were all fighting each other as much as they were fighting the Japanese. In the mountains south of Lake Lanao, Fertig found his first real ally, a Filipino constabulary captain named Luis Morgan. Morgan was mestizo, half American, half Filipino. He had been fighting the Japanese since the surrender with a small band of armed men. Morgan understood something critical. The Filipino guerrillas would never unite under a Filipino commander. There were too many tribal rivalries, too many religious divisions, too many personal grudges. But they might unite under an American. An American meant one thing to every Filipino on Mindanao: MacArthur was coming back. The Americans had not abandoned them. Morgan agreed to serve as Fertig's executive officer. In exchange, Fertig would be the face of the resistance, the American general who represented the promise of liberation. But Fertig faced a problem that no amount of rank could solve. Mindanao was not one island. It was a dozen different worlds. In the north, Christian Filipinos who had been educated in American schools and spoke English. In the south and west, the Moros, Muslims who had been fighting invaders since the Spanish arrived 4 centuries ago. The Moros trusted no one, not Christians, not Americans, not even other Moro tribes. In the highlands, pagan tribes who had never been conquered by anyone. Each group had its own language, its own customs, its own reasons to distrust outsiders. The Japanese exploited these divisions. They recruited collaborators from every community. They spread rumors that Americans had abandoned the Philippines forever. They paid informants in rice and money to report guerrilla movements. Every village Fertig entered could be a trap. And there was a deeper problem. Fertig had no way to contact Australia, no way to prove that MacArthur even knew he existed, no way to request supplies, weapons, or ammunition. The guerrillas were fighting with ancient rifles, homemade shotguns, and bolo knives. Some units had only 1 bullet per man, against Japanese troops with artillery, machine guns, and air support. Fertig needed a radio. Not just any radio, a transmitter powerful enough to reach Australia, over 2,000 miles away, on an island where the Japanese had confiscated every piece of communications equipment they could find. In late 1942, Fertig found a Filipino engineer named Placido Almendrez. Before the war, Almendrez had worked for a mining company maintaining electrical equipment. He knew radio theory, he knew electronics, and he believed he could build a transmitter from salvage parts. For weeks, Almendrez scavenged components from destroyed vehicles, abandoned mines, and burned-out buildings. Copper wire stripped from wrecked trucks. Vacuum tubes hidden by Filipino civilians before the Japanese arrived. A generator powered by a small gasoline engine. Piece by piece, he assembled a transmitter in a jungle clearing, hidden from Japanese patrols by triple canopy rainforest. The antenna was strung between 2 trees, camouflaged with vines. The generator had to be started by hand. The entire station could be dismantled and carried by porters in under 30 minutes if Japanese troops approached. In February 1943, Almendrez powered up the transmitter for the first time. The signal was weak. The frequency was unreliable. There was no guarantee anyone was listening. Fertig had one message to send, one chance to prove to MacArthur that an American officer was still fighting on Mindanao, one chance to bring his invisible army into the war. The message went out into the static, and Fertig waited for a response that might never come. The response came 3 weeks later, a faint signal from Australia crackling through the static. MacArthur's headquarters had received Fertig's transmission. They wanted verification. Anyone could claim to be an American officer. The Japanese had been known to operate fake radio stations to lure submarines into ambushes. MacArthur's intelligence staff sent a series of questions, personal details that only the real Wendell Fertig would know, his wife's name, his hometown, where he had gone to school. Fertig answered each one correctly, but MacArthur's staff remained skeptical. A mining engineer claiming to command guerrilla forces on Mindanao, a lieutenant colonel who had promoted himself to brigadier general. It sounded like either a Japanese trap or the delusions of a man who had lost his mind in the jungle. MacArthur sent back a blunt message. There would be no promotions to general rank for officers in the Philippines. Fertig would revert to colonel. If he wanted support, he would follow orders from Australia, and he would have to prove that his guerrilla force actually existed. Fertig accepted the demotion, but he kept wearing the silver stars. On Mindanao, he was still General Fertig. The rank meant everything to the Filipinos who followed him. The message from MacArthur meant even more. The Americans had not forgotten them. Help was coming. In March 1943, a United States Navy submarine surfaced off the northern coast of Mindanao. The USS Tambor carried a single passenger, Commander Charles Parsons, a naval intelligence officer who had lived in the Philippines before the war and spoke fluent Tagalog. Parsons had been sent to evaluate Fertig's operation, to determine if this self-appointed general was legitimate or insane. What Parsons found stunned him. Fertig had built an organization from nothing. Scattered guerrilla bands were being unified under a single command structure. Filipino officers were being trained in military discipline. Intelligence networks were being established in Japanese-occupied cities. Coast watcher stations were being set up along the shoreline to report enemy ship movements, and all of it was operating in territory controlled by tens of thousands of Japanese troops. Parsons returned to Australia with a recommendation. Fertig was not insane. He was building exactly what MacArthur needed: an army behind enemy lines that could provide intelligence, rescue downed pilots, and prepare for the eventual American invasion. The submarines began arriving regularly: USS Tambor, USS Thresher, USS Bowfin. Each boat carried supplies that Fertig desperately needed: rifles, ammunition, medical supplies, radio equipment. The submarines could only carry limited cargo, usually 4 to 7 tons per trip, but for an army that had been fighting with homemade weapons, even small shipments transformed their capabilities. Fertig established distribution networks across the island. Supplies landed on hidden beaches at night were loaded onto small boats and transported up rivers into the interior. From there, carabao carts carried crates along jungle trails to guerrilla camps scattered across the highlands. Every shipment had to move through territory where Japanese patrols could appear at any moment. The Japanese knew something had changed. Guerrilla attacks were becoming more frequent, more coordinated. Ambushes that had once been random harassment were now targeting specific objectives: bridges, supply convoys, communication lines. Someone was organizing the resistance. Japanese intelligence began hunting for the source. They increased patrols in the northern coastal regions. They interrogated captured guerrillas. They tortured Filipino civilians for information. And they learned a name: Fertig, an American general hiding somewhere in the mountains of Mindanao. By summer 1943, the Japanese had placed a price on Wendell Fertig's head. The exact amount was never recorded, but it was enough to tempt any Filipino struggling to survive under occupation. Fertig was now the most hunted man on an island of 8 million people, and his army was just beginning to grow. Fertig understood that guns alone would not hold Mindanao. The Japanese could always bring more soldiers, more artillery, more aircraft, but they could not govern an island whose people refused to be governed. Fertig was not just building an army, he was building a nation. By mid-1943, Fertig had established a civil government across guerrilla-controlled territory. The structure mirrored the pre-war Philippine Commonwealth. Provincial governors reported to Fertig's headquarters, municipal officials administered local affairs, courts settled disputes between civilians, a postal system carried messages between towns, hospitals treated wounded guerrillas and sick civilians, schools reopened to teach children in English rather than Japanese. Most remarkably, Fertig created a currency: guerrilla pesos printed on whatever paper could be found. The bills were crude, often hand-stamped, but Filipino merchants accepted them because Fertig's government backed them with a promise: when MacArthur returned, the United States would honor every guerrilla peso at face value. It was a promise Fertig had no authority to make, but the Filipinos believed him. The civil government accomplished something military force never could. It gave Filipinos a reason to support the guerrillas beyond hatred of the Japanese. Fertig's territory offered something the occupation could not: justice, education, medical care, hope. Scattered American servicemen began finding their way to Fertig's headquarters: soldiers who had escaped the surrender, pilots shot down over Mindanao, sailors from ships sunk in Philippine waters. By late 1943, 187 Americans served under Fertig's command. Former infantry officers led combat units. Navy radio men operated the communications network. Army Air Corps mechanics maintained captured Japanese equipment. Each man brought skills that strengthened the organization. Fertig divided his forces into 6 guerrilla divisions, each responsible for a different region of Mindanao. Division commanders operated with considerable independence, adapting to local conditions and local allies. In the north, Christian Filipino units ambushed Japanese convoys along the coastal highways. In the south, Moro fighters used their knowledge of the swamps and waterways to strike Japanese outposts and disappear before reinforcements arrived. The most improbable achievement was the guerrilla navy. Fertig armed small merchant vessels with machine guns salvaged from crashed American bombers. Some boats mounted homemade cannons. One vessel was armored with circular saw blades taken from abandoned lumber mills. These improvised warships attacked Japanese coastal shipping, intercepting supply barges and patrol boats. In one engagement, a guerrilla sailing ship armed with a 20mm cannon shot down a Japanese medium bomber. It may have been the only sailing vessel in the Second World War to destroy an enemy aircraft. The intelligence network grew even faster than the combat forces. Fertig established 58 radio stations across Mindanao. Coast Watcher posts monitored Japanese ship movements and reported directly to MacArthur's headquarters. Filipino agents in Japanese-occupied cities counted troops, mapped fortifications, and identified targets. When American submarines hunted Japanese shipping in Philippine waters, they relied on intelligence gathered by Fertig's network. By June 1944, MacArthur's Philippine Regional Section counted 169 radio stations operating across all major islands in the Philippines. Fertig's organization on Mindanao was the largest and most effective. His coast watchers tracked every Japanese vessel entering or leaving Mindanao's ports. His agents reported troop movements within hours of their occurrence. For MacArthur, planning the liberation of the Philippines, this intelligence was invaluable. But the Japanese had not been passive. In May 1943, they launched their first major offensive against Fertig's guerrillas. Thousands of troops swept through the northern provinces. Villages suspected of supporting the resistance were burned. Civilians were massacred as warnings. Japanese commanders believed a single concentrated campaign would destroy the guerrilla movement forever. They had badly underestimated what Fertig had built. The Japanese offensive of May 1943 was designed to be overwhelming. 3 columns of infantry pushed into the mountains from different directions. Aircraft bombed suspected guerrilla camps. Naval vessels blockaded the coastline to prevent supply submarines from landing. Japanese commanders expected to trap Fertig's forces between converging attacks and annihilate them. Fertig had prepared for exactly this scenario. His forces did not stand and fight. They scattered. Guerrilla units broke into small groups and melted into the jungle. Headquarters staff buried radio equipment and documents, then dispersed to prearranged hiding locations. Fertig himself moved constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice, guided by Filipino scouts who knew trails the Japanese had never mapped. The Japanese columns pushed deeper into the mountains. They found abandoned camps, cold fire pits, empty supply caches, but no guerrillas. The jungle swallowed their enemy whole. Patrols that ventured too far from the main columns were ambushed. Sentries were killed silently at night. Supply lines were cut by roadside bombs made from unexploded Japanese ordnance. After 6 weeks, the offensive collapsed. Japanese troops were exhausted, sick with malaria and dysentery, and demoralized by an enemy they could not find. They withdrew to their garrisons in the coastal cities. Within days of their departure, Fertig's guerrillas reoccupied their former positions. The radio stations came back on the air. The supply networks resumed operations. The civil government reopened its offices. The Japanese tried again in October 1943, and again in early 1944. Each offensive followed the same pattern: initial advances into guerrilla territory, weeks of fruitless searching, mounting casualties from ambushes and disease, eventual withdrawal. And each time, the guerrillas returned stronger than before. Japanese commanders began to understand the nature of their problem. They were not fighting an army, they were fighting a population. Every Filipino farmer could be a spy. Every village could be a supply depot. Every jungle trail could be an ambush site. Controlling Mindanao would require garrisoning every town, patrolling every road, watching every civilian. They did not have enough soldiers. The atrocities backfired catastrophically. Japanese troops burned villages to punish guerrilla supporters. They executed civilians as examples. They tortured prisoners for information. Each atrocity drove more Filipinos into Fertig's organization. Farmers who had tried to stay neutral joined the resistance after watching Japanese soldiers murder their neighbors. Young men who had hidden from both sides volunteered for combat units. The Japanese were creating the army they were trying to destroy. By mid-1944, Japanese intelligence estimated that Fertig commanded over 30,000 armed guerrillas. The actual number was impossible to determine. Fertig's organization blurred the line between soldiers and civilians. A farmer might plant rice in the morning and carry ammunition to a guerrilla camp in the afternoon. A fisherman might transport supplies by boat at night and sell fish in a Japanese-controlled market the next day. The entire population had become the enemy. Japanese headquarters in Manila reached a grim conclusion. Suppressing the Mindanao guerrillas would require a force larger than the garrison currently occupying the entire Philippine archipelago. Resources that were desperately needed elsewhere as American forces advanced across the Pacific. The High Command calculated that 24 additional battalions would be needed just to guard rear areas against guerrilla attacks. One soldier protecting supply lines for every 3 soldiers facing the American invasion. A captured Japanese staff document summarized the situation in a single sentence. It is impossible to fight the enemy and at the same time suppress the activities of the guerrillas. In October 1944, American forces landed on the island of Leyte, 300 miles north of Mindanao. MacArthur had returned. The liberation of the Philippines had begun, and Fertig's guerrillas were about to face their greatest test. MacArthur's return changed everything. For 2 years, Fertig's guerrillas had operated in isolation, surviving on submarine deliveries and captured Japanese equipment. Now they became the forward element of an invasion force. Every piece of intelligence they gathered, every Japanese soldier they killed, every supply line they cut directly supported the American advance. The submarines arrived with new urgency. USS Narwhal, one of the largest submarines in the Pacific Fleet, could deliver 100 tons of cargo per trip. Crates of M1 rifles replaced the ancient Springfields and homemade weapons. Cases of ammunition allowed units to stockpile supplies for sustained operations. Radios, medical equipment, and explosives poured into guerrilla camps across Mindanao. MacArthur's headquarters issued new orders. Fertig's forces were to intensify operations against Japanese communications, cut telephone lines, destroy bridges, ambush messengers. The Japanese garrison on Mindanao had to be isolated, unable to coordinate with forces on other islands, unable to request reinforcements, unable to report American movements. The guerrillas responded with a campaign of systematic destruction. In November 1944, sabotage teams cut the main telephone cables connecting Japanese headquarters in Davao with garrisons across the island. Repair crews sent to fix the lines were ambushed. When the Japanese switched to radio communications, guerrilla direction-finding teams located their transmitters. Coordinates were relayed to American aircraft. Within hours, Japanese radio stations were bombed into silence. Transportation networks collapsed under constant attack. Bridges that had survived 3 years of guerrilla harassment were now demolished with American-supplied explosives. Roads were blocked with felled trees and disabled vehicles. Japanese convoys that once moved freely between cities now required heavy armed escorts. Even then, ambushes inflicted steady casualties. A Japanese battalion that needed 2 days to march between garrisons before the invasion now needed 2 weeks. The intelligence flowing to MacArthur's headquarters reached unprecedented volume. Coast Watcher stations reported every Japanese ship movement in real time. Agents inside Davao counted troops, identified unit insignia, and mapped defensive positions. When American planners prepared for the Mindanao invasion, they had more detailed information about Japanese dispositions than for almost any other operation in the Pacific War. Japanese commanders faced an impossible situation. American forces were advancing through the Philippines. Leyte had fallen. Luzon was under assault. Every available soldier was needed to defend against the main invasion, but pulling troops from Mindanao would leave garrisons vulnerable to guerrilla attack. Leaving troops on Mindanao meant fewer defenders where the Americans were actually landing. The guerrillas had created a strategic paralysis. In desperation, Japanese headquarters ordered a final offensive against Fertig strongholds. If the guerrillas could be crushed before the American invasion, troops could be freed for other operations. In early 1945, Japanese columns again pushed into the mountains. They found the same result as every previous offensive: empty camps, vanishing enemies, ambushes on every trail, mounting casualties from an opponent who refused to stand and fight. The offensive was still underway when American forces landed on Mindanao. On April 17, 1945, elements of the 24th Infantry Division came ashore at Parang on the western coast of Mindanao. They expected weeks of hard fighting to secure the island. What they found astonished them. Fertig's guerrillas had already cleared the beach defenses. Japanese troops that should have opposed the landing were dead, wounded, or trapped in the mountains by guerrilla roadblocks. American soldiers moving inland were met by uniformed Filipino troops who had been fighting for 3 years. Guides who knew every trail. Intelligence officers who knew every Japanese position. Combat veterans who had already done most of the fighting. The Japanese garrison on Mindanao, once 50,000 strong, was shattered and scattered. Fertig had delivered MacArthur an island. The liberation of Mindanao took weeks instead of months. American commanders had planned for a grueling island-hopping campaign against entrenched Japanese defenders. Instead, their advance became a pursuit of broken enemy units already reeling from 3 years of guerrilla warfare. Japanese soldiers who had terrorized Filipino civilians were now hunted through the same jungles where they had once hunted Fertig. By early June 1945, organized Japanese resistance on Mindanao had effectively ended. Scattered units held out in remote mountain areas, but they posed no strategic threat. The island that had occupied 50,000 Japanese troops was secured with minimal American casualties. Military historians would later calculate that Fertig's guerrillas had killed over 7,000 Japanese soldiers during the occupation. They had wounded thousands more. They had tied down an entire army that could have been deployed elsewhere in the Pacific. MacArthur summoned Fertig to his headquarters. The general who had once questioned whether Fertig was sane or a Japanese trap now praised him as one of the most effective unconventional warfare commanders in American history. Fertig had done what no military academy had ever taught. He had built an army from nothing, in enemy territory, without supplies or support, and held an island larger than Taiwan against a modern military force. The awards followed. The Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism. The citation noted that Fertig had persisted in his enterprise, although a large price was set on his head, and he was, of necessity, in constant proximity to the enemy. The Distinguished Service Medal for organizing a well-disciplined and highly effective fighting force that confined the foe to certain heavily fortified areas. The Philippine government awarded him their highest military honors. The people of Mindanao treated him as a liberator, but the recognition that mattered most to Fertig came from the men who had served under him. Filipino guerrillas who had fought with homemade weapons against tanks and aircraft. American soldiers and sailors who had refused to surrender and spent 3 years in the jungle. Coast watchers who had risked execution to report enemy movements. Radio operators who had kept the network functioning under impossible conditions. They had built something unprecedented, a resistance army that had not merely survived, but had helped win a war. The strategic impact extended far beyond Mindanao. Across the Philippine archipelago, guerrilla forces had tied down 288,000 Japanese troops. Nearly a quarter of those soldiers were occupied solely with rear area security against partisan attacks. Every battalion guarding supply lines was a battalion not fighting American Marines on the beaches. Every soldier hunting guerrillas was a soldier not manning defensive positions. The Filipino resistance had multiplied American combat power without costing American lives. Japanese commanders had understood this too late. Their own after-action reports acknowledged the impossible mathematics they had faced. Suppressing guerrillas required troops. Troops pulled from combat units weakened defenses. Weakened defenses meant faster American advances. Faster advances meant less time to suppress guerrillas. The cycle was unbreakable. Military planners in Washington studied Fertig's methods. An engineer with no special forces training had accomplished what entire armies could not. He had understood that guerrilla warfare was not primarily about killing the enemy. It was about building an organization, creating legitimacy, winning the support of the population, making the occupier's position untenable through 1,000 small cuts rather than a single decisive battle. The lessons would reshape American military doctrine for decades to come. In the emerging Cold War, the ability to organize resistance movements behind enemy lines became a strategic priority. The military needed officers who understood what Fertig had learned in the jungles of Mindanao. The war was over, but Wendell Fertig's most lasting contribution was just beginning. Wendell Fertig returned to the United States in late 1945. He was 54 years old. He had spent 3 years in the jungle, hunted by an army, surviving on rice and determination. His hair had turned white. His body was ravaged by repeated bouts of malaria, but his mind was already focused on what came next. The Cold War was beginning. American military planners recognized that future conflicts might require exactly the skills Fertig had demonstrated: the ability to organize resistance movements, to build armies from local populations, to fight unconventional wars against superior forces. Fertig was assigned to help create something new, a military unit dedicated to special operations and psychological warfare. From 1951 to 1953, Fertig served as Special Forces Plans Officer and Deputy Chief of Psychological Warfare at Army Headquarters in Washington. He helped establish the Psychological Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. That center would later become the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School, the home of the Green Berets. Every Special Forces soldier trained at Fort Bragg learned doctrine that traced directly back to what Fertig had discovered on Mindanao. Fertig retired from the Army in the mid-1950s. He returned to Colorado and ran a mining company until his death on March 24, 1975. He was 74 years old. He never sought publicity. He never wrote his own account of the war. He let others tell his story. But in the Philippines, Fertig was never forgotten. When he returned to Mindanao after the war, Filipinos lined the streets to greet him. Some wept as they sang, "God Bless America." He had given them something during the darkest years of occupation, not just weapons or supplies: hope, the belief that they had not been abandoned, the promise that liberation would come. One military historian ranked Fertig among the 10 greatest guerrilla leaders in human history, alongside names like Lawrence of Arabia and Mao Zedong. An engineer from Colorado who had never commanded troops in battle before 1942. A man who built an army of 35,000 from scattered refugees hiding in the jungle. A man who held an island against 50,000 enemy soldiers for 3 years with bullets made from curtain rods. The Filipino government preserved his memory. Veterans organizations honored his surviving guerrillas. The story passed from generation to generation. The American general who refused to surrender, who gave his word that MacArthur would return, who kept that word through 3 years of war. Fertig understood something that military academies struggle to teach. Wars are not won only by firepower. They are won by people who believe their cause is worth dying for, who trust their leaders, who see a future worth fighting for. Fertig gave the people of Mindanao all three. 50,000 Japanese soldiers spent 3 years hunting one American engineer. They never caught him. They never broke his organization. They never conquered his island. Some men are remembered for the battles they won. Wendell Fertig should be remembered for the army he built, for the nation he created in the jungle, for the hope he kept alive when hope seemed impossible. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about engineers and guerrillas who saved lives with homemade radios and raw courage. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, the Philippines? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in the Pacific. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Wendell Fertig doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.